Caleb Ward's boots hit frozen ground the morning 3 black horses appeared on his ridge. Riders he didn't know, carrying an offer that could save everything he was about to lose. The lead man wore a city suit under ranch dust, and when he smiled, it didn't touch his eyes. "We'll pay triple what the bank wants," he said, voice smooth as oil on water. "All you have to do is give us the woman." Caleb's hand drifted toward the rifle against the porch rail. In the kitchen window behind him, Lena's shadow moved across yellow lamplight, the cook who'd somehow pulled his dying ranch back from the edge in 3 short months. The stranger's smile widened. "Think about it, Ward. Your legacy, or some girl you barely know." The wind cut across Silver Hollow like a blade, carrying the weight of a choice that would define everything to come. If you want to see how this impossible decision tears Caleb's world apart, stay until the end. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The ranch had been dying for 2 years before Caleb admitted it out loud. He stood in the pre-dawn cold of the main yard, watching Martin Cruz limp toward the equipment shed with tools that should have been replaced a decade ago. The foreman's leg had never healed right after that fall in the north pasture, but Cruz never complained, just worked slower, grimaced when he thought no one was looking, and got the job done anyway. 4 other men remained from the crew of 16 that used to keep Silver Hollow running. 4 men trying to do the work of 16, on a property that stretched across 12,000 acres of Montana grassland that didn't forgive mistakes. The cattle numbered less than 300 now. Should have been 800, maybe 1,000. Caleb's father had run 2,000 head in the good years, back when the Ward name meant something in these parts, back when Silver Hollow represented the kind of operation that lasted generations. But his father was 7 years dead, and Caleb had learned the hard way that inheritance meant debt as often as it meant legacy. The barn needed new roofing. The south fence line had gaps a man could walk through. 2 of the water pumps ran on prayer and stubbornness. The bunkhouse bunks sat empty, their mattresses stripped, because there wasn't money to pay the men who'd left, much less hire new ones. And the house, the big house his grandfather built in 1889, that was its own particular kind of deterioration. Caleb lived in 3 rooms of it now. The rest he'd closed off, unable to heat them through the winter, unable to look at the spaces his mother had filled with life before the fever took her when he was 12. He pulled his coat tighter and headed for the barn. The horses needed feeding, the cattle needed checking, the ranch needed saving, and Caleb was fresh out of ideas for how to do that. Cruz met him halfway across the yard. "Boss?" "Martin. Talked to Henderson at the bank yesterday." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I told you I'd handle Henderson." "Yeah, well, Henderson ain't waiting on your schedule." Cruz shifted his weight off his bad leg. "Says if we don't make payment by end of March, he's starting foreclosure proceedings. That's 6 weeks. I know how long 6 weeks is." "Do you know where we're getting $12,000? Caleb didn't answer. They both knew the answer was nowhere. He'd already sold off the equipment he could spare, already cut costs until there was nothing left to cut. The fall cattle sale had brought in enough to keep them limping through winter, but spring was coming, and spring demanded money they didn't have. "There's one other thing," Cruz said. His voice had gone careful. "Your cook quit." "What?" Mrs. Brennan didn't show up this morning, found a note in the kitchen saying her daughter in Billings needs her. She's gone. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Mrs. Brennan had been cooking for the ranch since before his father died. She was 63 years old, reliable as sunrise, and now... "Gone," he repeated. Cruz nodded. "Sorry, boss." They stood there in the growing light, 2 men running out of solutions on a property running out of time. "Get breakfast started," Caleb said finally. "I'll take care of the horses." He turned toward the barn before Cruz could see his face. The rest of the day passed in the kind of work that never actually ended, just paused long enough for a man to sleep before it started again. Caleb rode the north fence with Jackson, the youngest of the remaining crew, 19 years old and still learning which end of a post-hole digger mattered. They patched 3 breaks, replaced a section that had rotted through, and made note of a dozen more spots that needed attention they couldn't afford to give yet. By the time Caleb got back to the barn, the sun was dropping toward the mountains, and his shoulders felt like someone had driven fence posts through them. He found Cruz in the kitchen, standing over a pot of something that smelled like burnt beans. "Don't say it," Cruz muttered. "Wasn't going to." "We can't run this place without a cook, Caleb. The men are already stretched. They can't be wrangling cattle all day and trying to feed themselves at night. I know. So what's the plan? Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. It tasted like creek water filtered through old leather. I'll ride into Silver Hollow tomorrow, see if anyone's looking for work. Cruz snorted. Good luck. Word's out that we're sinking. No one wants to sign on to a ranch 6 weeks from foreclosure. Then I'll find someone who hasn't heard. Caleb, I'll find someone. He left before Cruz could argue further, taking his coffee out to the porch where the evening air bit at his face and the mountains went purple in the fading light. Somewhere out in the darkness, his cattle were bedding down. His horses were settling into their stalls. His land, his father's land, his grandfather's land, was waiting for him to figure out how to save it. The coffee had gone cold in his hand when he heard the sound of wheels on the drive. He turned, frowning. They weren't expecting anyone. The road to Silver Hollow Ranch didn't see much traffic these days. Just the feed supplier twice a month and Henderson from the bank when he wanted to remind Caleb how much trouble he was in. But the wagon that came up the drive wasn't the feed supplier's truck or Henderson's polished automobile. It was an old buckboard pulled by a single tired-looking mare and driven by a woman Caleb had never seen before. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard and climbed down with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done it 1,000 times. She was younger than Mrs. Brennan, maybe 30, maybe less, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and a canvas coat that had seen hard use. She carried a single carpet bag in one hand. "You Caleb Ward?" she called. Caleb set his coffee on the porch rail and descended the steps. "I am." "I'm Lena Hart." She said it like he should know the name. When he didn't react, she added, "I heard you need a cook." "Where'd you hear that?" "Diner in town. Mrs. Brennan's daughter was there this morning, talking about how her mother finally got away from this place." Lena's expression didn't change. Sounded like an opportunity. Caleb studied her. She didn't look like the kind of woman who'd driven a wagon 15 miles into the mountains on the rumor of a job. She looked, he searched for the word, determined. Like she'd made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of what he said next. "Job doesn't pay much," he said. "How much?" "Room and board. $30 a month if I can scrape it together." "That'll do. Works hard, crew's small, places." He gestured at the ranch around them, the peeling paint and sagging fence lines and general air of slow collapse. "We're not in good shape." "I can see that. So why do you want to work here?" For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Maybe I don't have better options." It was the kind of answer that raised more questions than it answered, but Caleb was too tired to chase them. He needed a cook. She needed work. The mathematics were simple, even if the woman wasn't. "You cooked before?" he asked. "Every day of my life." "Can you make biscuits that don't break teeth?" "I can make biscuits that'll make your men weep with gratitude." Despite everything, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "All right, you're hired. Kitchen's through that door. Bunkhouse bunks are mostly empty, so take your pick. Breakfast's at 5:30. Lena picked up her carpet bag. "I'll need to see your pantry and your budget." "Budget's whatever we have left after feeding the stock." "That's not a budget. That's a prayer." "Welcome to Silver Hollow Ranch, Miss Hart." She nodded once, sharp and businesslike, and headed for the house. Caleb watched her go, then turned to find Cruz standing in the barn doorway, arms crossed. "That was fast," the foreman said. "We need a cook." "We need a lot of things. Doesn't mean we pick up the first stranger who drives into the yard." "You have a better idea?" Cruz didn't answer. "Didn't think so," Caleb said, and went to put the horses to bed. Lena's first breakfast arrived at 5:30 on the dot. The men filed into the dining hall, really just the long room off the kitchen that had served as mess hall since Caleb's grandfather's time, expecting the kind of hurried, half-burnt meal they'd been choking down since Mrs. Brennan left. What they got instead was biscuits that actually rose, gravy that tasted like something other than flour and regret, eggs that hadn't been scrambled into rubber, and coffee that didn't require an act of will to swallow. Caleb watched Jackson take his first bite and go still. "Holy hell!" the kid breathed. Cruz was more restrained, but Caleb caught him glancing toward the kitchen with something that might have been hope. The other two men, Pete Larson and David Cho, cleaned their plates without comment, but both came back for seconds. Lena emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She wore a simple dress and apron, her hair still in that same efficient braid, and she moved through the room refilling cups like she'd been doing it for years instead of hours. "Miss Hart," Cruz said as she reached his cup. "That was exceptional." "It's just breakfast." "Ma'am, I've eaten breakfast on this ranch for 12 years. That was not just breakfast." The smallest smile touched her mouth, there and gone. "Glad you liked it." She finished her rounds and disappeared back into the kitchen. Caleb heard the sound of dishes being washed, efficient and quick. Jackson leaned across the table. "Boss, where'd you find her?" "She found us." "Well, don't let her leave. I'll work for free if it means eating like that every day." "You already work for almost free," Pete pointed out. "Then I'll work for actually free." Caleb stood, picking up his plate. "Get saddled. We've got the east pasture to check, and that fence line won't fix itself." The men filed out, moving with slightly more energy than they'd had in weeks. Caleb carried his dishes to the kitchen and found Lena elbow-deep in soapy water. "You didn't have to do that," he said, setting his plate on the counter. "Do what?" "Cook like that? We're used to simpler." She glanced at him, hands still moving through the dishes. "Simpler won't keep your men here when things get harder. Good food might." "Things are already hard." "They're about to get harder. Banks breathing down your neck, crews running on fumes, and you've got about 6 weeks before this place goes under unless something changes." She said it matter of fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. "You need every advantage you can get. Feeding your men well is the cheapest one you've got." Caleb stared at her. "How do you know about the bank?" "Heard it in town." "Heard a lot of things in town." She pulled the plug on the sink and dried her hands. "Also saw your books." You looked at the ranch books?" "They were on the desk in the office." Door was open. She met his eyes without apology. "You're worse off than I thought." Caleb felt heat rise in his face. "Miss Hart." "You're paying Mrs. Patterson $40 a month for laundry service you could do yourselves. You're buying feed from Morrison at a 20% markup when Jensen's offering the same quality for less. You haven't sold any stock since October, which means you're sitting on cattle that should have gone to market months ago, losing weight and costing you money every day they stand in your pasture. I know what shape we're in. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, you're bleeding money in a dozen places you could easily staunch, and you're so busy trying to keep this place running that you can't see where the leaks are." Caleb's jaw tightened. "If you're so smart about ranching, why are you looking for work as a cook?" Something flickered across her face, quick, guarded. "I didn't say I was smart about ranching. I said I was smart about numbers, and yours don't add up to survival unless you start making different choices." They stood there in the kitchen, morning light slanting through the windows, the smell of biscuits still hanging in the air. "What would you suggest?" Caleb asked finally. Lena wiped down the counter. "First, fire Mrs. Patterson. I can handle the laundry. Second, switch feed suppliers. Third, sell those cattle before they lose any more condition. Fourth," she paused. "Fourth, you need to bring more men back." "Can't afford them." "You can't afford not to. You're losing efficiency every day because you're understaffed. Jobs that should take 2 hours are taking 4. Fence that should have been fixed last month is still broken. You're in a death spiral, Mr. Ward. You're cutting costs, which means cutting manpower, which means cutting productivity, which means cutting income, which means cutting more costs." She looked at him. "Eventually you cut yourself right out of existence." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that it wasn't that simple, that he'd been trying. But she was right. He'd been so focused on not spending money that he'd stopped thinking about how to make it. "All right," he said, "make a list. Tell me what changes you think we should make. I'll look it over." "I already made a list." She pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket and handed it to him. "That's just the immediate stuff. There's more, but it can wait until you're not 6 weeks from foreclosure." Caleb unfolded the paper and scanned it. Her handwriting was neat, precise. The list was detailed, and every single item on it made sense in a way that made him feel like an idiot for not seeing it himself. "You did this last night?" he asked. "Couldn't sleep." "Why not?" She turned back to the counter, gathering the clean dishes. "New place. New job. Wanted to make sure I was useful." It was another non-answer, the kind that told Caleb there were things she wasn't saying. But he let it go. If she wanted to be useful, he'd let her be useful. He needed useful more than he needed explanations. "I'll look this over," he said. Thank you. She nodded without turning around. Caleb left her in the kitchen and went to saddle his horse, the list folded in his pocket, and a strange feeling working its way through his chest, something that felt almost like hope. Over the next 2 weeks, Silver Hollow Ranch began to change. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of transformation you'd see in a single day, but it was real. Lena took over the laundry, washing and mending in the hours between meals. She switched the feed supplier, cutting costs by 15%. She reorganized the kitchen, throwing out half the supplies that had been sitting unused for years and making room for the things they actually needed. She started keeping track of every dollar that came in and went out, noting it in a ledger she'd bought with her own money. And the food. The food kept getting better. She made stews that stuck to a man's ribs, bread that actually tasted like bread instead of compressed dust, roasts that fell apart under a fork, pies that made Jackson go quiet for entire meals, too focused on eating to talk. The men started coming to meals on time, started sitting a little longer at the table, started looking less worn down by the work. Caleb watched it happen and felt something shift in the foundation of his thinking. Lena had been right. Good food mattered. It mattered because it gave the men something to look forward to, something that wasn't just work and exhaustion and the slow creep of failure. But more than the food, it was Lena herself. She moved through the ranch like she'd been there for years instead of weeks. She learned everyone's name, their preferences, their quirks. She noticed when Pete's shoulder was bothering him and made a poultice that actually helped. She convinced Jackson to write to his mother, sitting with him at the kitchen table and helping him find the words. She even got Cruz to smile, which Caleb had started to think was impossible. And she worked. God, did she work. Caleb would come in from the pastures at sunset and find her in the kitchen, preparing dinner. He'd wake before dawn and she'd already be there, starting breakfast. She never complained, never slowed down, never asked for anything beyond what she needed to keep the household running. It was like she'd decided Silver Hollow was her responsibility, and she'd be damned if she let it fail. Caleb didn't know what to do with that. They didn't talk much beyond the practical. She'd give him updates on supplies, on the budget, on things that needed attention. He'd tell her about the work, the cattle, the fence lines. Their conversations were brief, functional. But sometimes, late at night, he'd catch her standing on the porch, looking out at the mountains the way he did when the weight of everything got too heavy. He never asked what she was thinking, didn't figure it was his business. But he wondered. The bank letter arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb found it in the mailbox at the end of the drive, mixed in with a seed catalog and a notice about a livestock auction. He knew what it was before he opened it. Henderson didn't send social correspondence. He stood by the mailbox and read it twice, the March wind pulling at the paper. Final notice: payment of $12,000 due by March 31st. Failure to remit will result in foreclosure proceedings. Please contact our office to discuss your options. 4 weeks. He had 4 weeks. Caleb folded the letter and shoved it in his coat pocket. When he looked up, he found Lena standing in the yard, a basket of clean laundry on her hip. "Bad news?" she called. "When is it ever good?" She crossed to him, set the basket down. "Show me." He handed her the letter. She read it once, her expression unmoving, then handed it back. "How much do you have?" "Maybe 4,000. If the cattle sale goes well, maybe 6. That's half. I can count, Miss Hart." "Can you get a loan?" "From who?" "Henderson's the only bank in 50 miles, and he's the one calling the note." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "What about the cattle? You've still got nearly 300 head. That's worth more than 6,000. "Not in March. Prices are low. Won't peak until late summer." "So wait until summer." "Can't wait. Notes due in 4 weeks. "Then make them worth more now." Caleb looked at her. "How?" "I don't know yet." She picked up the laundry basket. "But we've got 4 weeks to figure it out." She walked back toward the house, leaving Caleb standing by the mailbox with a foreclosure notice in his pocket and a cook who spoke like we instead of you, like his problem was her problem, like she had any reason at all to care whether Silver Hollow survived or died. He didn't understand her, didn't understand why she'd stayed, why she worked so hard, why she seemed to give a damn, but he was grateful for it. More grateful than he knew how to say. That night, After the men had gone to the bunkhouse and the ranch had settled into quiet, Caleb found Lena in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, the ranch ledger open in front of her, making notes by lamplight. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you." He poured himself coffee and sat across from her. "What are you working on?" "Trying to find $6,000 we don't have." She tapped the ledger. "If we sell the cattle now at current prices, we'll get maybe 5,000. That leaves us 7 short." "I know." "What about selling equipment? Land?" "Sold what equipment I can spare, land." He shook his head. "Even if I found a buyer, it'd take months to close." "We don't have months." She chewed her bottom lip, thinking. It was the first time he'd seen her look uncertain. "What about loans from private individuals?" she asked. "Anyone who owes you favors?" "Used those up last year." "Family?" "Dead or distant. Same thing, mostly." She sighed and sat back. "There has to be something." "Maybe there doesn't. Maybe this is just how it ends." Lena's head snapped up, her eyes sharp. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "It's true. It's not true until it happens, and it hasn't happened yet." She leaned forward. "You've got 4 weeks, Caleb. 4 weeks is a lifetime if you use it right." "Use it to do what?" "Whatever it takes." They sat there in the lamplight, the ledger between them, the impossible math of survival spread across the page. "Why do you care?" Caleb asked quietly. "You've been here less than a month. This isn't your ranch, isn't your debt. You could walk away tomorrow and no one would blame you." Lena didn't answer right away. She looked down at the ledger, her fingers tracing the columns of numbers. "I've walked away from enough things," she said finally. "I'm tired of it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Caleb wanted to push, wanted to demand a real explanation, but something in her voice stopped him, something that sounded like pain wrapped up tight and held down hard. So instead he said, "All right, we've got 4 weeks. Let's figure out what the hell we're going to do with them." Lena looked up, met his eyes. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled, really smiled, full and genuine. "Yeah," she said. "Let's." They worked until midnight, building plans they both knew were long shots at best. But they built them anyway, because the alternative was giving up, and neither of them seemed capable of that. When Caleb finally climbed the stairs to his room, he felt exhausted and half crazy, and more alive than he'd been in 2 years. Lena Hart had driven into his yard with a carpet bag and a wagon, and somehow, in less than a month, she'd given him something he'd thought he'd lost forever: a reason to fight. The men started coming back a week later. First, it was Tommy Reeves, who'd left the previous summer to work at the lumber mill in Whitefish. He showed up with his hat in his hands and asked if Caleb had any openings. "Heard things were turning around here," Tommy said. "Heard you had a new cook who could make a meal worth remembering." Caleb hired him on the spot. Then came Marcus Webb and his brother Ray, both of whom had worked for Silver Hollow in the old days. Then Charlie Hendricks. Then Owen Price. By the end of the second week, Caleb had 11 men on the crew. He couldn't afford all of them, not really. But Lena had worked the numbers, stretching the budget in ways that didn't quite make sense, but somehow held together, and she'd convinced him that the extra hands would pay for themselves in productivity. She'd been right about that too. With more men, they got the fence lines repaired, got the barn roof patched, got the equipment serviced, got the cattle rounded up and sorted, ready for sale. The ranch started to look like something other than a slow collapse. Started to look like a working operation. And at the center of it all, quiet and constant, was Lena. She fed the growing crew without complaint, kept the books balanced, found ways to cut costs that Caleb had never considered, worked from before dawn until after dark, every single day, never asking for anything in return. The men loved her, not in a romantic way, though Jackson might have been nursing a small crush, but in the way you loved someone who made your life better just by being present. They brought her wildflowers from the meadow, fixed things around the kitchen without being asked, spoke to her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Caleb watched it happen and felt something complicated twist in his chest. He'd started noticing things about her. Small things. The way she tucked hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way she hummed while she worked, tuneless and unconscious. The way she stood on the porch in the evenings, watching the mountains like she was memorizing them. The way she smiled at him sometimes, rare, quick, when something went right. He told himself it didn't mean anything. She was his employee. He was her boss. They had a working relationship and nothing more. But late at night, alone in his room, he'd catch himself thinking about her in ways that had nothing to do with cooking or bookkeeping or ranch management. He'd think about the curve of her neck, the sound of her laugh when Jackson told a bad joke, the way she'd looked at him in the lamplight, fierce and determined, saying, 4 weeks is a lifetime if you use it right. And he'd wonder what it meant that a woman he barely knew had somehow become the person he thought about most. The riders came on a Wednesday. 3 men on black horses moving up the drive at a steady walk. They wore range clothes but carried themselves wrong, too stiff, too careful. City men playing at country. Caleb was in the barn when Cruz found him. "Boss, we've got visitors." "Who?" "Don't know. They look like trouble." They walked out together. The 3 men had dismounted in the yard. The one in front wore a dark suit under a duster, expensive boots, and a hat that had never seen real work. He was smiling. "Caleb Ward?" he called. "That's me." The man approached with his hand extended. "Name's Richard Voss. I'm here on behalf of a mutual acquaintance." Caleb didn't take the hand. "Don't have many acquaintances." Voss's smile didn't falter. "Perhaps not, but you have something my employer is very interested in acquiring." "Not selling." "You haven't heard my offer yet." "Don't need to. Ranch isn't for sale." "I'm not talking about the ranch, Mr. Ward." Voss glanced toward the house. "I'm talking about your cook." Everything went very still. "Lena Hart," Voss continued. "My employer has been looking for her for quite some time. Imagine our surprise when we learned she'd taken employment at a failing ranch in the middle of Montana." He pulled an envelope from his coat. "We're prepared to compensate you handsomely for your trouble. $50,000. Cash. More than enough to save this place." Caleb stared at him. "Get off my land." "Mr. Ward," "I said get off my land." Voss's smile finally faded. "You're making a mistake. My employer is not a man who handles disappointment well." "I don't give a damn about your employer. You've got 10 seconds to get back on those horses." The 2 men behind Voss shifted, hands moving toward their coats. Caleb heard Cruz move beside him, heard the subtle click of a hammer being drawn back. Voss raised a hand. "Gentlemen, let's not be hasty." He looked at Caleb. "Think about it, Ward. $50,000. Your legacy, or some woman you barely know. 1. She's not who you think she is. 2. She's dangerous. Brought trouble everywhere she's been. 3. Voss's jaw tightened. He tucked the envelope back in his coat. "You've got until Friday to change your mind. After that, my employer will come collect what's his, and he won't be offering money." He turned and walked to his horse. The 3 men mounted and rode out, slow and deliberate, like they owned the place. Caleb watched them until they disappeared down the drive. Then he turned and headed for the house. He found Lena in the kitchen, her face white, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "How much of that did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Who's Richard Voss?" "He works for a man named Daniel Cord. I used to—" She stopped, swallowed. "I used to work for Cord in Chicago. I saw things I shouldn't have seen, did things I shouldn't have done. When I tried to leave, he—" Her hands were shaking. "I ran, changed my name, thought I'd gotten far enough away." "What did you do for him?" "Kept his books. His real books. The ones that showed where the money actually went, who he paid, who he hurt." She looked at Caleb, her eyes bright with fear. "I can testify against him, put him in prison for the rest of his life. He knows that, so he's been looking for me." Caleb felt cold spread through his chest. "For how long?" 2 years. And now he's found you." "Now he's found me." She pushed away from the counter. "I'll leave, tonight, before he comes back. You don't need this, Caleb. You've got enough—" "No." She stopped. "What?" "I said no. You're not leaving." "Caleb, you helped save this ranch, Lena. Turned it around when it was dying. I'm not handing you over to some Chicago mobster because he's made threats. It's not just threats. Cord doesn't make threats. He makes promises." Her voice cracked. "If I stay, he'll come for me, and he'll burn this place to the ground to get me." "Then let him try." "You don't understand. I understand just fine." Caleb closed the distance between them. "I understand that you're part of this place now. part of what we're building, and I don't leave my people behind. Lena stared at him, tears slipping down her cheeks. Why? Why would you risk everything for me? Caleb didn't have a good answer for that. Didn't have words for the complicated tangle of feelings that had been growing in his chest for weeks now. So instead he said, because it's right. And because I'm tired of losing things that matter. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. You're insane. Probably. He's going to kill you. He's going to try. Lena wiped at her eyes, her hands still shaking. What are we going to do? Caleb thought about the ranch, about the men in the bunkhouse, about the 4 weeks they'd spent fighting for survival. We're going to get ready, he said. And when Cord comes, we're going to show him what happens when you threaten Silver Hollow. Lena nodded slowly. Then, before Caleb could move, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. He froze for a second, surprised. Then, carefully, he put his arms around her and held on. She felt small against him, fragile. But when she pulled back and met his eyes, there was steel in her gaze. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Caleb said. This is going to get ugly. I know. People might get hurt. I know. We might lose everything. I know. She smiled, sad and fierce. But at least we'll fight. Caleb nodded. Yeah, at least we'll fight. Caleb called the men together that night in the bunkhouse. All 11 of them crowded into the long room with its iron stoves and worn bunks. Cruz stood by the door, arms crossed. Jackson sat on the edge of his bed, young face tight with worry. The others arranged themselves around the room, waiting. Caleb told them everything. About Voss, about Daniel Cord, about Lena's past and the threat that was coming. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the wind against the windows. Finally, Pete Larson spoke up. So you're saying some Chicago gangster is going to show up here and try to take Miss Hart? That's what I'm saying. And you told him no. I did. Pete nodded slowly. Good. Good? Tommy Reeves shifted in his seat. Boss, no offense, but we're ranch hands, not gunfighters. What are we supposed to do against men like that? Fight, Caleb said simply. Or leave. I'm not going to force any of you to stay. This isn't your fight. But I'm staying. And I'm asking if any of you will stay with me. Marcus Webb cleared his throat. Miss Hart's done right by us. Fed us better than we've eaten in years. Worked harder than anyone had a right to expect. Way I see it, we owe her. Damn right, his brother Ray added. Charlie Hendricks spat tobacco into a cup. Besides, I never liked Chicago men. Too fancy. That's not a reason to risk your life, Charlie, Caleb said. Ain't it? I've risked my life for worse reasons. Charlie looked around the room. How many of us came back here because of her? Because word spread that Silver Hollow was turning around, that there was good food and honest pay and a place that felt like it might last. We came back because of what she built here. So yeah, I'll fight for that. One by one, the others nodded. Jackson stood up, trying to look older than 19. I'm in. Jackson, I said I'm in, boss. You're not talking me out of it. Caleb looked at Cruz. The foreman shrugged. You know I'm staying. Someone's got to keep you from getting killed doing something stupid. Despite everything, Caleb felt his throat tighten. All right, then we prepare. We've got until Friday, maybe less. That gives us 2 days. To do what? Owen Price asked. Make this place defensible. Board up windows. Set up firing positions. Move the ammunition from the storage shed to places we can reach it. And we send someone to town for the sheriff. Cruz shook his head. Sheriff McKenzie won't come. Silver Hollow's outside his jurisdiction, and he's not the type to stick his neck out for trouble that isn't his. Then we do this ourselves. They worked through the night. Caleb sent Marcus and Ray into town at first light, with instructions to telegraph the federal marshal's office in Helena. It was a long shot. Marshals didn't usually concern themselves with ranch disputes, but if Lena's testimony could put Daniel Cord in prison, maybe they'd care enough to send someone. The rest of the crew fortified the ranch. They nailed boards across the lower windows of the main house, leaving slits for rifle barrels. They moved supplies, ammunition, medical kit, food, water, into the house and barn. They set up positions on the second floor with clear sight lines to the approach road. They brought the horses into the near corral where they could be protected. Lena worked alongside them, her face set with determination. When Caleb tried to convince her to stay inside, she'd looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "This is happening because of me," she said. "I'm not hiding while you fight. You're not a gunfighter. Neither are you." She had a point. They worked through Thursday into Thursday night. By Friday morning, the ranch looked like a fortress, or as close to one as 11 men and a cook could manage in 2 days. Caleb stood in the yard at dawn, checking the positions one more time. Cruz joined him, rifle in hand. "You think they'll actually come?" the foreman asked. "Yeah, I think they'll come." "How many?" "More than 3. Voss didn't strike me as the type to make empty threats. He'll bring enough men to make sure he gets what he wants." Cruz spat in the dirt. "Then we're in for a hell of a day." "Probably." They stood there in the growing light, 2 men waiting for a fight neither of them wanted, but both of them would see through. "Caleb," Cruz said quietly, "you know this might not work, right? We might lose. They might take her anyway." "I know. And you're still doing this." "I'm still doing this." Cruz nodded. "Then I guess we'd better not lose." The riders appeared just after noon. Caleb counted 12 of them coming up the road, dark shapes against the pale grass, moving at an easy walk like they had all the time in the world. They spread out as they approached, not quite a line but close enough to make their numbers clear. Richard Voss rode in front, still wearing that city suit. The men behind him looked harder than the ones he'd brought Wednesday, range tough, weathered, the kind of men who knew their way around violence. The crew gathered in defensive positions, Cruz and Pete on the second floor of the house, Marcus and Ray in the barn loft, Charlie and Owen behind the water trough, Tommy and Jackson near the equipment shed, David Cho on the porch with a shotgun. Caleb stood in the yard, rifle in his hands, waiting. Voss pulled his horse to a stop 20 yards out. His men fanned behind him, hands resting on gun belts. "Mr. Ward," Voss called. "I'm disappointed. I really hoped you'd see reason. I see it fine. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave." "Can't do that. My employer wants his property back." "Miss Hart isn't property. That's a matter of perspective." Voss shifted in his saddle. "You've got one last chance to do this the easy way. Bring her out, take the money, and we all walk away. Or we take her anyway, and you get buried on land you're about to lose to the bank." Voss smiled. "Either way, Daniel Cord gets what he wants. You're just deciding how much blood gets spilled in the process." Caleb raised his rifle, aiming at Voss's chest. "Here's my decision." Around the yard, he heard the crew shift, metal clicking, hammers cocking, bodies settling into firing positions. Voss's smile faded. "You're making a mistake." "Wouldn't be the first time." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind pulled at coats and hats, carried the smell of horse and gun oil, and the particular tension that came before violence. Then Voss raised his hand. "Take the ranch," he said. Everything happened fast after that. Voss's men spurred forward, drawing weapons as they rode. Caleb fired, saw Voss's horse stumble, dumping the man sideways into the dirt. Then the air filled with gunfire, sharp cracks echoing off the mountains, smoke blooming in the yard, men shouting. Caleb dove behind the porch rail as bullets chewed into the wood above his head. He came up firing, dropped one of the riders, ducked again as return fire punched holes in the porch post. From the second floor, Cruz's rifle barked steadily. In the barn, Marcus and Ray laid down covering fire. Charlie's revolver boomed from behind the water trough. But there were too many of them. Voss's men scattered across the yard, using the outbuildings for cover, firing from multiple angles. One of them threw a torch at the barn. The hay caught fast, smoke billowing black against the sky. "Barn's on fire!" Marcus shouted. Caleb swore and ran for the water pump, bullets kicking up dirt around his boots. He got the pump going, started filling buckets, passed them to David Cho, who ran them toward the barn in a crouch. A bullet caught David in the shoulder, spun him around. He went down hard, the bucket spilling across the dirt. "David!" Jackson started to run toward him. "Stay in position," Caleb yelled, but the kid was already moving, sprinting across open ground to reach the fallen man. Jackson grabbed David under the arms and started dragging him toward cover. A rifle cracked from near the equipment shed. Jackson jerked, stumbled, but kept moving. He got David behind the porch, both of them bleeding, both of them alive. Caleb covered them, firing until his rifle clicked empty. He fumbled for cartridges, hands shaking with adrenaline, reloaded, and kept shooting. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames climbing the walls, heat shimmering the air. They weren't going to save it. The best they could do was keep the fire from spreading to the house. From the second floor, crews picked off another of Voss's men, but the return fire was intensifying, bullets punching through the boards they'd nailed over the windows, forcing the men inside to duck and cover. Caleb saw Voss behind the water trough now, shouting orders, coordinating the attack. The man's suit was ruined, covered in dirt, but his eyes were cold and focused. "Concentrate fire on the house," Voss yelled. "Drive them out." The gunfire shifted, dozens of rounds slamming into the house walls, the porch, the windows. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Somewhere inside, someone cried out in pain. Caleb tried to move toward the house, but the fire was too heavy. He was pinned behind the porch rail, unable to advance, unable to retreat, watching his ranch burn and his men bleed and knowing they were losing. Then Lena stepped out the front door. "No!" Caleb screamed. She walked down the porch steps with her hands raised, moving into the open yard. The gunfire slackened, then stopped. Voss's men held their positions, weapons trained on her. "Stop shooting," Lena called, her voice carried across the yard, clear and steady. "I'll go with you. Just stop shooting." Voss stood up from behind the trough, brushing dirt off his ruined suit. "Now we're being reasonable." "Let them go," Lena said. "All of them. Take me and leave the ranch alone." "Lena, don't Caleb started, but she cut him off with a look. "It's over, Caleb. Too many people are hurt. I won't let anyone else die for me." Voss walked toward her, slow and confident. "Smart girl. I knew you'd see sense eventually." He reached for her arm. The sound of horses came from the east, hard and fast, a lot of them. Everyone turned. 6 riders crested the ridge, moving at a gallop. The lead man wore a silver badge on his vest that caught the sunlight. U.S. Marshal. Behind them came more riders, Sheriff McKenzie from Silver Hollow Town, along with what looked like half the county's able-bodied men. The marshal pulled his horse to a stop, surveyed the burning barn and the armed men and the bodies in the dirt. "Richard Voss," the marshal called, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder." Voss's face went white. "You can't." "I can, and I am. We've got testimony from 3 of Daniel Cord's former associates. They turned state's evidence this morning. Cord's in federal custody in Chicago. His organization's done." The marshal gestured to the men around Voss. "Drop your weapons, all of you." For a second, Caleb thought Voss might fight. The man's hand hovered near his gun, jaw clenched tight. Then Sheriff McKenzie raised his rifle. "Don't be stupid, Richard. It's over." One by one, Voss's men dropped their guns and raised their hands. The marshal's deputies moved in, cuffing them, leading them toward horses. Voss stood rigid, staring at Lena with something like hatred. "You did this," he said. "You brought them here." Lena met his eyes. "I sent a telegraph to the federal prosecutor in Chicago 2 weeks ago. Told him where I was. Told him I'd testify. Looks like he believed me." Voss's hands curled into fists, but there was nothing he could do. The deputies took him away. The marshal approached Caleb and Lena. "Miss Hart, I'm Marshal William Porter. We're going to need your testimony in Chicago. Can you be ready to travel by Monday?" Lena nodded. "I'll be ready." Porter glanced at the burning barn, the wounded men, the bullet-riddled house. "Hell of a mess you've got here." "Yeah," Caleb said. "It is." The marshal tipped his hat. "We'll camp nearby tonight. Head out at first light. I'll send a doctor for your wounded." He looked at Lena. "You did the right thing reaching out. Cord's hurt a lot of people. Your testimony's going to put him away for life." After the marshal left, the crew gathered in the yard. David and Jackson were being tended to by crews who'd pulled medical supplies from the house. Neither wound was fatal. David's shoulder was clean through. Jackson had taken a graze across his ribs. But both men needed proper doctoring. The barn was a total loss. It collapsed inward as they watched, sending up a column of sparks and ash. The house had taken heavy damage, walls pocked with bullet holes, windows shattered, the porch rail splintered and broken. But they were alive. All of them. Caleb found Lena sitting on what remained of the porch steps, staring at the smoking ruins of the barn. He sat down beside her. "You knew," he said quietly. "That day Voss came. You'd already contacted the marshal. I couldn't tell you. Couldn't risk Cord finding out I'd turned. He had people everywhere." She looked at him. I'm sorry. For the barn, for all of this. You saved us. If the marshal hadn't shown up, you'd have fought until they killed you, I know. Her voice cracked. That's why I had to do something. I couldn't let you die for me, Caleb. I couldn't. So you risked yourself instead. That's different. How? Because I'm the one they want. I'm the one who brought this down on you. Caleb turned to face her fully. You also brought hope, brought the crew back, brought this place back from the edge. You think I'm angry about the barn? I'm not. I'm grateful you're alive. Lena's eyes filled with tears. I have to leave Monday, go to Chicago, testify. It could take months. I know. The ranch needs rebuilding. You need help. I won't be here. We'll manage. Caleb, we'll manage, he repeated, then quieter. But I want you to come back. She stared at him. What? When it's done. When you've testified and Cord's in prison and you're free, I want you to come back. He took a breath. If you want to. Why would I want to? Because this is your home now. These men are your family, and He stopped, searching for words that didn't sound insane. I don't want to lose you. Lena let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. You're asking me to come back to a bullet-riddled ranch in the middle of Montana to cook for cowboys and fix your terrible bookkeeping? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm asking. She wiped at her eyes, smiling despite the tears. You're crazy. Probably. The barn's gone. The house is destroyed. You still owe the bank $12,000. I'm aware. And you think I'd want to come back to this? Caleb met her eyes. I'm hoping. Lena was quiet for a long time, looking at the smoking ruins, the damaged house, the men gathered in the yard tending wounds and counting losses. Then she said, I'll come back. Caleb felt something tight in his chest loosen. Yeah? Yeah. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm in his. But you better have that barn rebuilt by the time I get here. Deal. They sat there on the broken porch, holding hands like teenagers, while around them the ranch smoldered and the crew worked to salvage what they could from the wreckage. It was a mess, a complete disaster. But it was theirs, and they were going to rebuild it together. The next morning, Lena packed her carpet bag. She'd arrived with almost nothing, and she left with almost nothing. A few clothes, the ledger she'd been keeping, a photograph that Marcus had taken of the whole crew standing in front of the barn before it burned. The men gathered in the yard to see her off. Marshal Porter waited with his deputies, horses ready. Jackson approached first, his ribs bandaged but his spirits high. Miss Hart, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Take care of that wound, Jackson, and write your mother. Yes, ma'am. One by one, the others said goodbye. Cruz shook her hand formally, his usual stern expression softening. Come back safe. I will. Pete and Charlie and the rest of them each took their turn, awkward and sincere, thanking her for meals and kindness and the way she'd made Silver Hollow feel like home again. Finally, only Caleb remained. They stood facing each other in the morning light, the mountains behind them, the damaged ranch spread around them. I meant what I said, Caleb told her, about wanting you to come back. I know. I meant what I said too. Good. She stepped close and hugged him, quick and tight, her face pressed against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held on, memorizing the feel of her, the smell of flour and soap that always seemed to cling to her clothes. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. Build that barn, she said. I will. And fix the books properly this time. I'll try. Don't try. Do it. Despite everything, Caleb smiled. Yes, ma'am. Lena climbed onto the horse Marshal Porter had provided. She looked down at Caleb one more time, her expression fierce and sad and determined all at once. Don't die before I get back, she said. Wouldn't dream of it. She turned the horse and rode out, following the marshal and his deputies down the long drive towards Silver Hollow town and the train that would carry her east to Chicago and testimony and justice. Caleb watched until she disappeared from sight. Then he turned back to the ranch, to the smoking ruins and damaged buildings and wounded men, and got to work. They started with the basics, clearing debris from the barn site, salvaging what lumber they could, making lists of what needed replacing. The house repairs came next, boarding up the broken windows properly, patching the bullet holes, sweeping up the glass and splinters. Cruz handled the crew assignments while Caleb rode into town to meet with the bank. Henderson sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression as cold as January. "Mr. Ward, I heard about your excitement yesterday. News travels fast? In a town this size, everything travels fast." Henderson opened a folder on his desk. "Your note is still due March 31st. That's 3 weeks from today." "I know. Do you have the money?" "No." Henderson sighed. "Then I don't see what we have to discuss. The bank will begin foreclosure proceedings on April 1st. "What if I had a plan?" "A plan isn't money, Mr. Ward. It's a plan to get money." Caleb leaned forward. "Give me 60 days. I'll sell the cattle early, bring in what I can. I'll cut costs further, and I'll find a way to make up the difference." "How?" "I don't know yet, but I'll find a way." Henderson stared at him. "You're asking me to extend credit to a ranch that just got shot to pieces by Chicago gangsters. I'm asking you to bet on me, one more time." "Why should I?" "Because if you don't, you get a bullet-riddled property you'll have to sell at a loss. But if you do, if you give me 60 days, you might actually get your money back." Caleb held the banker's gaze. "You've known me my whole life, Henderson, known my father. You know I'm good for it." Henderson was quiet for a long time. Finally, he opened a drawer and pulled out a form. 60 days, he said, "but the interest goes up. And if you miss this deadline, I take the ranch immediately. No more extensions, no more chances." "Understood. I'm doing this against my better judgment." "I appreciate it anyway." Caleb signed the papers and left before Henderson could change his mind. Outside, Cruz was waiting with the wagon. "Well?" the foreman asked. "We've got 60 days?" Cruz let out a breath. "That's something, at least. It's everything. Now we just have to figure out how to use it." They drove back to the ranch in silence, both of them doing math that didn't quite add up to survival but might, with luck and work, and something close to a miracle, add up to one more chance. The crew had cleared most of the barn debris by the time they returned. Marcus had drawn up plans for a new structure, smaller than the original, cheaper to build, but functional. Ray was already cutting lumber. "We can have it framed in 2 weeks if we push," Marcus reported. 3 to get it fully enclosed." "Do it," Caleb said. They worked from dawn until after dark, every day, pushing through exhaustion and pain and the constant weight of the calendar counting down. The barn took shape slowly, posts and beams rising from the ashes of the old one, walls going up board by board. The house repairs went faster. They had the windows replaced in a week, the porch rebuilt in another. It wouldn't win any prizes for appearance, but it was solid, functional. And the books. Caleb threw himself into understanding the ranch finances the way Lena had understood them. He went through every line of the ledger, every expense, every source of income. He found waste she'd already identified and waste she hadn't. He renegotiated contracts, cut unnecessary costs, squeezed every dollar until it bled. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open, making calculations by lamplight, trying to find $12,000 in numbers that only added up to 8. He was still 4,000 short. The letters from Lena started arriving in the second week. The first one was brief. She'd arrived safely in Chicago, met with the federal prosecutor, begun preparing her testimony. The trial was scheduled for late April. She was staying in a boarding house under marshal protection. The second letter was longer. She wrote about the city, the noise, the crowds. She missed the mountains, missed the quiet, missed the food she could cook in a kitchen that didn't have 6 other boarders competing for stove space. The third letter asked about the ranch. How were the repairs coming? Had they finished the barn? Was Jackson's wound healing properly? Had Caleb figured out the bookkeeping mess yet, or was he still trying to make sense of her notes? Caleb wrote back every time. Short letters, mostly, updates on the work, on the crew, on the progress they were making. He didn't mention the money problems, didn't want to burden her with worries she couldn't fix from 1,000 miles away. But in the fourth letter, he told her he missed her. It felt dangerous to write, like admitting something he shouldn't admit, but it was true, and he was tired of not saying true things. Her response came a week later. "I miss you too. More than I probably should. Chicago is loud and crowded, and I hate it. I keep thinking about the mountains, about the porch at sunset, about your terrible coffee and Cruz's worst jokes, and the way Jackson tells stories that don't have endings. I keep thinking about home. Come back soon, Caleb wrote. The barn's almost done. The house looks better, and my coffee's improved. Slightly. Don't lie to me, Ward, she wrote back. Your coffee is still terrible, but I'm looking forward to complaining about it in person. March became April. The barn got finished. Not beautiful, but standing, ready for hay and horses and the normal work of ranch life. The house gleamed with fresh paint. The fence lines were repaired. The cattle were fat and ready for market. And Caleb was still $4,000 short. He'd sold everything he could sell, cut every cost he could cut, worked the crew harder than he had any right to, pushed himself past exhaustion into something that felt like desperation. The deadline was 2 weeks away. He sat in the kitchen late one night, staring at numbers that refused to change no matter how many times he added them up, when Cruz found him. Boss, you need to sleep. Can't afford to sleep. Can't afford to collapse either. Cruz pulled out a chair and sat. We're not going to make it, are we? It wasn't a question. No, Caleb said. We're not. What are you going to do? I don't know. They sat there in the lamplight, two men who'd fought and bled and built and worked themselves ragged, facing the reality that it still wasn't enough. Maybe it's time to let go, Cruz said quietly. You gave it everything. Sometimes everything isn't enough. Lena said 4 weeks is a lifetime if you use it right. Lena isn't here. But she's coming back. She's testifying against Cord, then she's coming back. And I told her we'd be here. Caleb looked at his foreman. I can't let her come home to nothing. Caleb, there has to be something, some way to make this work. Cruz was quiet for a moment. Then, there might be one option. What? Early cattle drive. Push the herd to market now instead of waiting for summer. Prices are lower in April, but if we could get them to the railhead at Billings, we might make enough. Billings is 200 miles, through rough country. We'd lose weight on the cattle, maybe lose some entirely. I know, but it's the only play we've got left. Caleb thought about it. It was risky, the kind of plan that could backfire spectacularly, but Cruz was right. It was the only play they had. How fast could we move, he asked. 2 weeks, maybe less if we push hard, but it'd be brutal. The men are already exhausted. Would they do it? For Miss Hart? Yeah, they'd do it. Caleb made the decision then, sitting in the kitchen at midnight with numbers that didn't add up and a deadline that wouldn't wait. All right, we drive the cattle to Billings, leave in 3 days. Tell the men to prepare. Cruz stood. This is either going to save us or kill us. Probably both. The foreman almost smiled. Yeah, probably. They moved out at dawn on the 4th of April with 283 head of cattle and every man the ranch could spare. Caleb left Tommy Reeves and David Cho behind to watch the property. David's shoulder still wasn't healed enough for hard riding, and someone needed to stay. The rest of them, 9 men and 300 animals, headed east toward Billings and a market that might save them or might not. The first day was chaos. Cattle didn't want to move in early spring. They wanted to graze, to spread out across good grass, to do anything except walk in a tight herd for 12 hours straight. The crew worked nonstop, riding the edges, pushing stragglers, keeping the whole mass moving forward when every instinct the animals had told them to stop. By nightfall, they'd covered maybe 8 miles. At that rate, they'd reach Billings sometime in July, long after the bank had foreclosed and sold the ranch to someone else. Caleb gathered the men around the fire that night. They were camped in a shallow valley with decent grass and a creek running through it. The cattle had finally settled, exhausted from fighting the drive all day. We need to move faster, Caleb said. Cruz poured coffee from the pot, his face lined with exhaustion. Can't push them harder without losing them entirely. They're already stressed. Then we need to be smarter. Rotate the point riders more often so nobody's eating dust all day. Space the herd wider so they're not trampling each other. And we start earlier before dawn while it's cool and they're rested. Boss, we're already running on nothing, Pete Larson said. Starting earlier means less sleep. I know, but we don't have a choice. We've got 10 days to cover 200 miles. That's 20 miles a day, every day, no breaks. Caleb looked around the fire at faces that were young and old, experienced and green, but all of them showing the same bone-deep tiredness. I know what I'm asking. If any of you want to turn back, I won't hold it against you." Nobody moved. Finally, Jackson spoke up. "Miss Hart would tell us to quit whining and get it done." Despite everything, Cruz smiled. "Yeah, she would." "Then that's what we'll do," Marcus said. He raised his tin cup. "To Miss Hart, and to getting this damn herd to Billings before we all die of exhaustion." The others raised their cups, and they drank to a woman 1,000 miles away who'd somehow become the reason they were willing to kill themselves on a cattle drive that probably wouldn't work anyway. The second day, they covered 15 miles. The third day, 18. By the fourth day, they'd found a rhythm. The herd moved easier, the men worked smoother, and the miles started adding up. They crossed into flatter country where the grass was better and the cattle didn't fight as hard. They pushed through dawn into dusk, stopping only when darkness made it too dangerous to continue. Caleb wrote to Lena every night, short notes scribbled by firelight, and handed off to passing riders headed back toward Silver Hollow. He told her about the drive, the progress, the men. He didn't tell her about the constant fear that they wouldn't make it, that even if they did make it, the prices would be too low, that everything they were doing might be for nothing. Her letters reached him in return, carried by the same riders. She wrote about the trial. It had started, and she'd spent 2 days on the witness stand describing Daniel Cord's operation in detail that made the jury go pale. The prosecutor thought they had a strong case. Cord's lawyers were fighting hard, but the evidence was overwhelming. "I think we're going to win," she wrote. "I think he's going to prison, and then I'm coming home." "We'll be there," Caleb wrote back. "The ranch will be there. I promise." It was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, but he wrote it anyway. On the 5th day, the weather turned. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and dark, and by mid-afternoon the sky had opened up. Rain came down in sheets, turning the ground to mud, making the cattle nervous and skittish. They tried to scatter, to turn back, to do anything except keep moving forward through water that ran in rivers down the trail. The crew fought to hold them together. Caleb rode point, hat pulled low against the rain, shouting directions that got lost in the downpour. Cruz worked the left flank, Marcus the right, all of them soaked through and shivering but refusing to stop. Lightning cracked overhead. Thunder rolled across the prairie, and the cattle, already spooked, started to run. "Stampede!" someone yelled. Someone sheed. The herd broke into a full gallop, 300 animals moving as one panicked mass. The ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Men scattered, trying to get out of the way, trying to turn the lead animals, trying to do anything to stop the momentum. Caleb spurred his horse alongside the running cattle, leaning into the storm, fighting for position. If he could get to the front, if he could turn the leaders, he might be able to circle them back before they scattered completely. He pushed harder, his horse straining beneath him, rain hammering his face. He drew even with the lead steer, a big, rangy animal with wild eyes, and started to angle it left. The steer turned. Slowly, grudgingly, but it turned. Behind it, the rest of the herd began to arc, following the leader in a wide curve that brought them back around toward the rest of the crew. Cruz saw what Caleb was doing and pushed from the other side, tightening the circle, slowing the momentum. Gradually, impossibly, the stampede became a mill, cattle running in a tight circle, burning off their panic. And then, finally, blessedly, they stopped. Caleb sat his horse in the rain, chest heaving, watching the herd settle. Around him, the crew emerged from cover, checking animals, counting heads, making sure nobody was hurt. "We lose any?" Caleb called. Marcus did a quick count. "Maybe 10. Could have been worse." "Could have been a lot worse," Cruz added. He looked at Caleb. "Good riding, boss." Caleb didn't answer. He was too tired, too wet, too aware of how close they'd come to losing everything. They made camp that night in miserable conditions, wet gear, wet ground, wet wood that wouldn't catch fire. The men huddled under what shelter they could find, chewing on cold jerky and hard biscuits, too exhausted to complain. Jackson sat next to Caleb, his young face drawn. "You really think we're going to make it?" "I don't know." That's not very reassuring. "You want me to lie?" Jackson thought about it. "No, I guess not." He was quiet for a moment. "My dad used to say that the only difference between failing and succeeding was refusing to quit. You think that's true?" "Sometimes. Other times you can refuse to quit and still fail. But at least you tried, right? At least you went down fighting." Caleb looked at the kid, 19 years old, soaked to the bone, exhausted beyond measure, but still here, still willing to push forward. Yeah, at least you went down fighting. Jackson nodded and pulled his coat tighter against the cold. The rain stopped before dawn. They moved out in weak sunlight, the ground still muddy but passable, the cattle subdued after their panic the day before. They made good time, 22 miles by Caleb's estimate, and camped that night near a river crossing. Cruz studied the water, his expression troubled. Current's fast. Cattle aren't going to want to cross. We don't have a choice. This is the only ford for 30 miles. I know, just saying it's going to be rough. It was worse than rough. They started the crossing at first light, pushing the lead animals into water that came up to their bellies, then their shoulders. The current grabbed them, swept them downstream, made them bellow with fear. But the crew kept pushing, kept driving, kept forcing the herd forward. Halfway across, one of the younger steers lost its footing. The current rolled it sideways, pulled it under. It surfaced 20 yards downstream, thrashing, and went under again. Charlie Hendricks didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse into the current, riding hard downstream, rope already spinning. He got ahead of the steer, through the loop, caught it around the horns. His horse set its legs and pulled. The steer came up fighting, water streaming off its hide. Charlie dragged it toward the far bank, his horse straining against the weight and the current. They made it to shallow water and the steer scrambled onto dry ground, alive and furious. The rest of the herd followed, one animal at a time, until finally the entire mass was across and climbing the far bank. Caleb counted heads. They'd lost 3 in the crossing. 270, he said. Could have been worse, Cruz repeated, like he'd been saying for days now. Keep saying that, and eventually we won't have any cattle left. Just trying to stay positive, boss. They pushed on. The land flattened further, opened up into rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon. The weather held, clear and cool, perfect for moving cattle. They covered 23 miles the 7th day, 24 the 8th. On the 9th day, they saw the smoke. It came from the east, a dark smudge against the sky. As they got closer, Caleb could make out the source. A ranch house burning, flames visible even from miles away. They detoured to investigate. The place was a ruin. House gone, barn collapsing, everything that could burn already reduced to ash. But in the yard, a family huddled together, a man, a woman, 3 small children, watching their lives turn to smoke. Caleb dismounted and approached. What happened? The man looked up with hollow eyes. Cattle thieves. Came through last night. Took our herd, burned the buildings when we tried to stop them. Said it was a lesson. How many? 6 of them, maybe 8, headed east. The man's jaw tightened. They took everything. We've got nothing left. Cruz had joined them. You report it to the law? Nearest law is 2 days' ride. By the time they get here, those thieves will be in the next territory. Caleb looked at the burning house, the children with soot on their faces, the woman clutching a blanket that was probably the only thing she'd managed to save. We can spare some supplies, he said. Food, blankets. It's not much, but I can't pay you. Didn't ask you to. They unloaded what they could spare. Jerky, beans, coffee, a couple of bedrolls. It wasn't enough to rebuild a life, but it might keep the family alive until they figured out what came next. The man gripped Caleb's hand. Thank you. Thank you. As they rode away, Jackson looked back at the burning ranch. That could have been us. If things had gone different with Cord. Yeah, Caleb said. It could have. Makes you think, doesn't it? How fast everything can fall apart. Try not to think about it too hard, kid. We've got our own problems. They made camp that night in sight of Billings. The town sat on the horizon, lights twinkling in the darkness, close enough to smell the smoke from cook fires and hear the distant sound of a train whistle. Tomorrow they'd drive the herd into the stockyards. Tomorrow they'd find out if 270 head of cattle were enough to save Silver Hollow Ranch. Tonight they just sat around the fire and tried not to think about what failure would mean. You ever wonder if it's worth it? Pete asked. He was staring into the flames, his lined face thoughtful. All this work, all this struggle, for what? A piece of land that wants to kill you half the time? It's not about the land, Marcus said. Then what's it about? Marcus gestured around the fire. This. People you can count on. Work that matters. Knowing that you're building something that might last. Might being the key word. Nothing lasts forever, Pete. But some things last long enough to be worth fighting for. Ray Webb nodded. Miss Hart understands that. She could have run when Cord came, could have disappeared, started over somewhere else. But she stayed and fought. Because the ranch mattered. Because we mattered. She's got more guts than sense, Charlie said, but there was admiration in his voice. Don't we all, Cruz added. We're here, aren't we? Driving cattle through hell in the hopes of maybe saving a ranch that's probably doomed anyway. You're real inspiring tonight, Martin, Caleb said. Just being honest. Jackson poked at the fire with a stick. You think she's okay? In Chicago? She's tougher than all of us combined, Caleb said. She'll be fine. I hope so. Place won't be the same without her. They fell quiet after that, each man lost in his own thoughts, until finally exhaustion dragged them toward their bedrolls and what little sleep they could grab before dawn. Caleb lay awake, staring at stars that seemed impossibly far away, and thought about Lena testifying in a Chicago courtroom, about a ranch waiting back in Montana, about 270 cattle that had to be enough because there was nothing else left to try. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The cattle shifted and settled, and the world kept turning toward whatever came next. They drove the herd into Billings at noon the next day. The stockyards were massive, pens stretching in every direction, thousands of animals waiting to be sold and shipped east. The smell of manure and dust hung heavy in the air. Men moved between the pens, examining cattle, making deals, shouting numbers that meant everything to the sellers and nothing to the buyers. Caleb found the yard manager, a thick-built man named Harrison, who looked like he'd been doing this job since before Caleb was born. What have you got? Harrison asked. 270 head, mixed breed, good condition considering we just drove them 200 miles. Harrison walked to the pen where Cruz and the others had gathered the herd. He climbed the fence, studied the cattle with eyes that missed nothing, then climbed back down. They've lost weight on the drive, probably stressed. Market's soft right now anyway. He pulled out a ledger. I can give you $14 a head. Caleb felt his stomach drop. That's barely $4,000. That's the market. I need more than that. Then you should have waited until summer when prices are higher, or not driven them so hard they look half dead. Harrison's expression didn't change. 14 a head, take it or leave it. Caleb looked at Cruz, who'd come over to hear the negotiation. The foreman's face was grim. We need at least 18, Caleb said, turning back to Harrison. These are quality animals. They'll gain that weight back in a week on good grass. Might not. I'm not paying for might. Harrison closed his ledger. Got 3 other herds coming in today, all in better shape than yours. If you don't want 14, someone else will take it. Caleb felt rage building in his chest. They'd come so far, worked so hard, lost so much, and it still wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Boss, Cruz said quietly, maybe we should... Wait, a new voice cut in. They turned. A man in a good suit and clean boots approached. City clothes, but worn like someone who actually worked instead of just playing at it. He was maybe 40, with sharp eyes, and the kind of face that was hard to read. Name's Coleman, the man said. I represent the Continental Beef Company. We contract with the Army, supply beef to forts across 3 territories. I've been watching your cattle. And, Caleb asked, and they're exactly what we need. Tough animals that can handle hard conditions. The Army doesn't want pampered stock. They want cattle that'll survive being shipped to the middle of nowhere and still put meat on soldiers' plates. Coleman pulled out his own ledger. I'll give you $22 a head for the lot. Caleb stared at him. What's the catch? No catch. We need cattle. You have cattle. That's how commerce works. Coleman glanced at Harrison. Unless you've already made a deal. Not yet, Caleb said quickly. He did the math in his head. 22 times 270 was $5,940, Coleman said, reading his expression. Cash paid today. Do we have a deal? Caleb looked at Cruz again. The foreman was trying not to smile. We have a deal, Caleb said. Coleman extended his hand and they shook. I'll have my men start the paperwork. You'll have your money within the hour. He walked away, already calling orders to his crew. Harrison shook his head. You just got lucky, Ward. Don't count on it happening twice. Don't plan to, Caleb said. But luck or not, they'd done it. almost $6,000. Combined with what they had in the bank, it was enough, barely enough, cutting it close enough to feel like a miracle, but enough. Silver Hollow Ranch wasn't going to foreclosure. The crew gathered in the Silver Star Saloon that night, every man with a beer in hand, exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the wake of relief so profound it felt like being drunk. "To the boss," Marcus said, raising his glass, "who just drove us through hell and came out the other side with a miracle." "Wasn't a miracle," Caleb said. "It was dumb luck." "I'll take dumb luck over smart planning any day," Charlie said. They drank to that, and then to a dozen other things, to the cattle, to the weather holding, to making it across the river, to not dying in the stampede, to Miss Hart, who'd be proud of them even if she'd probably yell at them for being reckless. Jackson, slightly drunk on half a beer, stood up. "Speech." "Sit down, kid," Caleb said. "Speech, speech." The others picked up the chant, grinning, and Caleb realized he wasn't getting out of this. He stood, feeling foolish, and raised his glass. "All right. You want a speech? Here it is. 2 weeks ago, we were broke. A month ago, we got shot to pieces by Chicago gangsters. 3 months ago, this ranch was dying, and we all knew it." He looked around at faces that had become familiar as family. "But we didn't quit. We worked. We fought. We drove 280 head of cattle through rain and stampedes and river crossings, and we made it. So here's what I want to say. Thank you for staying, for fighting, for giving a damn about a piece of land that probably doesn't deserve you. Bari it binset get the days. It deserves us," Cruz said. "And we deserve it. That's how this works." Caleb nodded. "Yeah, I guess it is." They drank until the money ran out and the bartender kicked them out, then stumbled back to the boarding house where they'd rented rooms for the night. Tomorrow they'd start the long ride home. Tomorrow they'd face whatever came next. But tonight, they'd won. And that was enough. Caleb wrote to Lena before he slept, his handwriting shaky from exhaustion and alcohol. "We did it. Sold the cattle for enough to save the ranch. Barely enough, but enough. The crew was incredible. Every single one of them. I wish you could have seen it. We're heading home tomorrow. The ranch will be there when you get back. I promise. I kept my word. Come home soon. We miss you. I miss you." Caleb, he sealed the letter and left it at the front desk to be posted, then climbed the stairs to his room and fell asleep fully clothed, his boots still on, too tired to care about anything except the fact that they'd survived. The ride home took 4 days. They moved slower without the cattle, stopping in towns to resupply, to rest, to let the exhaustion bleed off gradually instead of all at once. Caleb used the time to think about the ranch, about the future, about Lena, and what it meant that he couldn't stop thinking about her. She'd been gone for weeks, and it felt like years. The ranch felt empty without her in the kitchen, without her managing the books, without her steady presence reminding them all what they were working toward. He told her to come home. But what if she didn't want to? What if Chicago had reminded her that there was a whole world beyond Silver Hollow, beyond Montana, beyond cooking for cowboys on a ranch that had almost failed? What if she'd changed her mind? "You're brooding," Cruz said, riding alongside him. "I'm thinking." "That's what I said, brooding." The foreman studied him. "You're worried about Miss Hart." "I'm not. Yeah, I am. She'll come back." "You don't know that." "I know her. She said she'd come back, so she'll come back." Cruz was quiet for a moment. "Question is, what are you going to do when she does?" "What do you mean?" "I mean you're in love with her, and everyone except maybe you has noticed. So what are you going to do about it?" Caleb felt heat rise in his face. We work together. She's my employee. She's more than that, and you know it. She saved the ranch, saved us, risked her life testifying against Cord so we'd all be safe. You think she did that just because she likes cooking?" "I don't know why she did it." "Then maybe you should ask her when she gets home." Cruz's expression softened. "Life's too short to waste on being careful, Caleb. You want something, you fight for it. You know that better than anyone." They rode in silence after that, but Cruz's words stayed with Caleb, echoing in the space between heartbeats. They reached Silver Hollow on the 14th of April, late afternoon, the mountains rising in the west like they'd been waiting. Tommy and David met them in the yard, both men grinning. "You made it," Tommy said. "We made it." Caleb dismounted, his legs stiff from days in the saddle. How's the ranch? Good. Quiet. Got a telegram for you. Came in yesterday. He handed over the folded paper. Caleb opened it, heart suddenly pounding. Trial concluded. Cord convicted. 20 years prison. Coming home. Arrive Silver Hollow 20th. Lena. Caleb read it twice, then looked up at the crew gathered in the yard. She's coming home, he said. The men erupted in cheers, hats thrown in the air, Jackson actually whooping like a kid. Even Cruz smiled, wide and genuine. When? Marcus asked. 20th, 6 days. We better get this place cleaned up then, Charlie said. Can't have her coming home to a mess. They scattered, each man finding tasks that suddenly felt urgent. Caleb watched them go, still holding the telegram, still trying to process the fact that in 6 days Lena would be back and everything would what? Go back to normal? Nothing about this was normal. Nothing about what he felt for her was normal. He folded the telegram carefully and put it in his pocket. 6 days. He could figure out what to say in 6 days. Probably. They spent those days cleaning, repairing, preparing. The house got scrubbed until it gleamed, the new barn got stocked with fresh hay. The kitchen, Lena's domain, got organized exactly the way she'd had it, every pot and pan and utensil in its proper place. On the morning of the 20th, Caleb rode into town to meet the train. He stood on the platform, hat in his hands, watching the track stretch toward the horizon. Other people waited too, families, merchants, drifters, but Caleb barely noticed them. His entire focus was on the distant sound of the train whistle, growing louder, coming closer. The train appeared, massive and loud, trailing steam and smoke. It pulled into the station with a shriek of brakes and a hiss of released pressure. Passengers began disembarking. A businessman with a leather case, a family with too many children, an elderly woman who needed help with her bags. And then Lena stepped down onto the platform. She wore the same canvas coat she'd left in, her hair in the same practical braid, carrying the same carpet bag. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. But when she saw Caleb, her face transformed. She smiled. Really smiled. The kind of smile that felt like sunrise. Caleb crossed to her, moving before he could think better of it, and pulled her into a hug that lifted her off her feet. She laughed against his shoulder, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on tight. "You're here," he said into her hair. "I'm here. The ranch is still standing. I knew it would be. You promised." He set her down but didn't let go, his hands on her arms, just looking at her. "How was the trial?" "Long, brutal. But we won. Cord's going to prison for the rest of his life. I'm free." She looked up at him. "Really free." "Good. That's good." They stood there on the platform, people moving around them, the world continuing while they occupied their own small bubble of reunion. Finally, Lena stepped back. "So, should we go home?" "Yeah," Caleb said. "Let's go home." They rode back to the ranch together, Caleb driving the wagon, Lena beside him, talking about Chicago and the trial and the city and how much she'd hated every minute of being away. He told her about the cattle drive, about the storm and the stampede and the river crossing, about Coleman and the miracle sale that had saved them. "You drove cattle 200 miles in 10 days?" she asked, incredulous. "Had to. It was the only way." "That's insane. You told me 4 weeks was a lifetime if I used it right. I used it." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "You're going to tell me you did it for me, aren't you?" "Would that be the wrong thing to say?" "No. It'd be exactly the right thing." She looked at him sideways. "But you're terrible at saying things like that, so I'll save you the trouble. Thank you. For fighting. For keeping your promise. For being here." "I'll always be here," Caleb said. It came out more intense than he'd meant, more revealing. But Lena didn't pull away. Instead, she reached over and took his hand. They rode the rest of the way like that, hands linked, not talking, just being together. The crew was waiting when they arrived, all of them lined up in the yard like a military inspection. When Lena climbed down from the wagon, they erupted in greetings, Jackson hugging her, Cruz shaking her hand formally, the others crowding around to welcome her home. She laughed and cried and hugged them all, and Caleb stood back and watched his broken crew, the men who'd stayed and fought and driven themselves past exhaustion, welcome back the woman who'd given them a reason to care. That night, they had a celebration. Cruz cooked, badly, but nobody complained because Lena was home and the ranch was saved and Daniel Cord was in prison. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything was actually all right. Late in the evening, after the men had drifted off to the bunkhouse, Caleb found Lena on the porch. She was standing in her usual spot, looking at the mountains, and he joined her without speaking. "Missed this view," she said after a moment. "Missed having you here to share it with." She glanced at him. "Caleb Ward, are you about to say something emotional?" "Might be. Should I brace myself?" "Probably." He took a breath. "When you left, I told you I wanted you to come back. What I didn't say was why. I didn't say that these past months you became the most important thing. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not any of it. You. And when you were gone, nothing felt right. So I fought for the ranch because I promised I would. But really I was fighting for this. For you standing on this porch, home where you belong." Lena was very still. "Caleb, I love you," he said, just putting it out there, simple and plain. "I know that's probably not what you want to hear. I know I'm just some broke rancher who almost lost everything, but it's true, and I wanted you to know." She turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable in the darkness. Then she stepped close, put her hands on his face, and kissed him. It was gentle and fierce, and full of everything they hadn't said, everything they'd both been too scared or too stubborn to admit. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "You're not just some broke rancher," she said. "You're the man who fought Chicago gangsters and saved a dying ranch and kept every promise he ever made to me. And I love you too. Have for a while now. Just took me this long to admit it." Caleb pulled her close, wrapped his arms around her, and held on like he'd never let go. Above them, the stars wheeled across a sky so vast it made every problem seem small. Behind them, the ranch sat quiet and whole. And in that moment, standing on a porch in the middle of Montana with a woman who'd somehow become his entire world, Caleb Ward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The relief lasted exactly 3 days. Caleb was in the barn checking tack when Cruz found him, holding a letter that had come with the morning mail. The foreman's expression told him everything before he spoke. "Henderson wants to see you, says it's urgent." Caleb took the letter and read it quickly. The banker's handwriting was precise, clinical, payment received and credited to account. However, outstanding debts from previous years remain unpaid. Total amount due, $8,347. Payment required by May 15th to avoid foreclosure proceedings. He read it again, certain he'd misunderstood. "What previous debts?" "I don't know, but Henderson doesn't make mistakes with numbers." Caleb's hands tightened on the paper. They'd just paid off the main note. They'd saved the ranch. And now, "I'm riding into town," he said. Henderson sat behind his desk, looking exactly as he always did. Comfortable, immovable, a man who dealt in facts and didn't much care about feelings. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Mr. Ward, thank you for coming so promptly. What's this about $8,000? Caleb put the letter on the desk. "We paid what we owed. The note's settled." "The March note, yes. But there are other obligations, loans your father took out in 1891 and 1893. They've been accruing interest for years. I've been lenient, given your circumstances, but the bank can't carry indefinite debt. My father's been dead 7 years. Why bring this up now? Because now you have the means to pay. You just sold cattle for nearly $6,000. The bank assumes you can manage the rest." Henderson folded his hands. "Mr. Ward, I understand this is difficult, but debt doesn't disappear because we ignore it. Your father borrowed money. That money is owed." Caleb felt the floor dropping out from under him again. "I don't have $8,000. I barely have anything left after covering the March payment and keeping the ranch running. Then I suggest you find it. You have until May 15th. That's 3 weeks. "Yes, it is." Caleb stood, too angry to sit still. "You know I can't raise that kind of money in 3 weeks. We just drove ourselves half to death to save this place. What do you want from me?" "I want you to meet your obligations. Failing that, I want the property that secures those obligations." Henderson's voice didn't rise. "I'm not trying to ruin you, Mr. Ward. I'm trying to run a bank. Those are different things, even if they don't feel different to you right now." Caleb left without another word. He rode back to the ranch in a fog of rage and disbelief, the same circular thoughts chasing themselves through his head. $8,000. 3 weeks. Impossible mathematics wrapped in the kind of cruelty that only paperwork could deliver, polite and legal and absolutely devastating. Lena was in the kitchen when he returned. She took one look at his face and set down the bread dough she'd been kneading. What happened? He told her everything. The old debts, Henderson's ultimatum, the deadline that might as well have been tomorrow for all the chance they had of meeting it. Lena listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each sentence. When he finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and reached for her coat. "Where are you going?" Caleb asked. "To look at your father's financial records. If Henderson says there are old debts, I want to see the original loan documents. Make sure the numbers are actually what he claims." "You think he's lying?" "I think bankers make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes favor the bank." She pulled on her coat. "Where did your father keep his papers?" "Office, top drawer of the desk." She was gone before he could offer to help, moving with the kind of focused determination that meant she'd found a problem to solve and wouldn't stop until she'd solved it. Caleb stood in the kitchen alone, feeling useless. He should be doing something, making plans, finding solutions. But all he could think about was the look on Lena's face when he'd told her they might lose everything after all. They'd fought so hard, survived so much, and it still wasn't enough. Cruz found him an hour later, still standing in the same spot. "Boss, you okay?" "No." "Yeah, didn't think so." The foreman poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Caleb. "Miss Hart's tearing through the office like a woman possessed. What's she looking for?" "Proof that Henderson's wrong, or proof that he's right. I'm not sure which would be worse." They drank in silence for a moment. "We could sell more cattle," Cruz offered. "We still have breeding stock." "Not enough. And if we sell the breeding stock, we can't rebuild the herd. Might as well just give Henderson the ranch and be done with it." "What about a loan from someone else?" "From who?" "Every bank in 3 territories talks to each other. Henderson will have told them all we're a risk." Caleb set down his cup. "We're out of options, Martin. I think this is really it." Cruz was quiet. Then, "You going to tell the men?" "Have to. They deserve to know. They're not going to take it well. They just got Miss Hart back. They just saved this place. You tell them it's over anyway and—" He shook his head. "It'll break something." "I know." Lena appeared in the doorway, holding a stack of papers, her face pale. "Caleb, you need to see this." She spread the documents across the kitchen table. Loan agreements from 1891 and 1893, signed by Caleb's father in handwriting he recognized. The amounts were exactly what Henderson had claimed. $8,000 borrowed against the ranch, to be repaid with interest over 10 years. The first loan had been taken out the year Caleb's mother died. The second, 2 years later, when a harsh winter had killed half the herd. "He was trying to save the ranch," Lena said quietly. "After your mother passed, he needed money for medical bills. Then he needed money to restock cattle. He kept borrowing, thinking he'd catch up eventually. But he didn't. No, he died before he could pay it back." She tapped one of the documents. "But here's the thing. Look at the repayment schedule." Caleb looked. The first loan should have been paid off in 1901, the second in 1903. Both deadlines had passed years ago. "Henderson should have called these loans a decade ago," Lena said. "The fact that he didn't means he was either being incredibly generous or he was waiting for an excuse to take the ranch," Cruz finished. "Maybe. Or maybe he just figured a dead man's debt wasn't worth pursuing until the son started making money again." Lena gathered the papers. "Either way, the debt is real. Your father owed it, you inherited it, and Henderson wants it paid." Caleb slumped into a chair. "So that's it. We're done." "Not necessarily." Lena sat across from him. "We have 3 weeks. That's enough time to try." "Try what?" "I don't know yet. But sitting here accepting defeat isn't going to save us." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We didn't come this far to give up now. Lena, there's no money, no time, no plan." "Then we make a plan. We find money. We use the time we have." Her grip tightened. "You told me once that 4 weeks is a lifetime if you use it right. We've got 3. Let's use them." Caleb looked at her. At the fierce determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the absolute refusal to accept that they were beaten, and felt something shift in his chest. She was right. They'd survived gangsters and stampedes and river crossings. They could survive this too. Maybe. "All right," he said. "What do we try first?" Over the next 2 days, they tried everything. Caleb rode to every neighboring ranch within 50 miles, asking for loans. Most turned him down outright. They had their own problems, their own debts. A few offered small amounts, 100 here, 200 there. By the time he'd exhausted every possibility, he'd scraped together $800. Lena wrote letters to every business contact she'd had in Chicago, people who'd known her before she fled, asking if they'd invest in a Montana cattle ranch. Most didn't respond. 2 wrote back with polite refusals. 1 sent $50 and a note wishing her luck. Cruz and the crew took odd jobs in town, fence repair, barn building, anything that paid. They worked from dawn until dark, then came home and worked the ranch, running on determination and coffee. In a week, they'd earned $300. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. Caleb sat at the kitchen table on the 8th day with the ledger open, adding up numbers that refused to reach 8,000, no matter how many times he tried. Total available, $1,400. Amount needed, $8,000. Shortfall, $6,600. Lena came to stand behind him, her hands on his shoulders. "We could sell equipment." "Already sold everything we can spare." "The horses?" "We need them to work the ranch. Sell the horses and we can't function." "What about the land itself? Sell off a section to raise cash." Caleb had thought of that. "Takes months to sell land. We have 2 weeks." "Then what?" He didn't have an answer. That night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Lena breathe beside him. They'd been sharing a room since she came back, not married yet, but close enough that the crew had stopped pretending to be surprised when they saw them together. It felt right, having her there. Felt like something he should have done months ago. But none of that mattered if they lost the ranch. "You're thinking too loud," Lena murmured. "Sorry, don't be. I'm awake too." She rolled to face him. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking we're going to lose, that no matter what we do, it won't be enough. Henderson's going to take the ranch and there's nothing we can do to stop him." "You don't know that." "I do. We've tried everything, Lena. We're out of options." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if we're asking the wrong question?" "What do you mean?" "We keep trying to raise $8,000. But what if we can't? What if instead of trying to pay the debt, we try to eliminate it?" Caleb propped himself up on one elbow. "How?" "I don't know. But there has to be something. Some legal angle, some technicality. Henderson waited 10 years to call these loans. Maybe there's a statute of limitations. Maybe the debt's not legally enforceable anymore. That's a long shot. So was selling the cattle. So was surviving Cord. We're good at long shots." Despite everything, Caleb smiled. "You really don't quit, do you?" "Neither do you. That's why we're good together." She kissed him quickly. "Tomorrow we ride to Helena, find a lawyer who knows banking law. See if there's any way to fight this legally." "That'll cost money we don't have." "Then we'll borrow it. From the crew, from the neighbors, from whoever will lend it. But we're not giving up, not yet." They left for Helena at dawn, just the 2 of them, leaving Cruz in charge of the ranch. The ride took a full day, arriving in the territorial capital as the sun dropped behind the mountains. Helena was 10 times the size of Silver Hollow, a real city with paved streets and electric lights and buildings that stretched 3 stories high. They found a boarding house near the Capitol building and paid for a room with money they couldn't afford to spend. The next morning, they started visiting lawyers. The first 3 turned them away. Banking law was complicated and frontier debt cases were messy. The 4th lawyer listened to their story, examined the loan documents Lena had brought, and shook his head. "The debt is valid. Your father signed these agreements. The fact that the bank waited to collect doesn't invalidate the obligation." "But isn't there a statute of limitations?" Lena asked. "Not in Montana. Not for secured debt." The lawyer handed back the papers. "I'm sorry, but unless you can prove fraud or forgery, you're bound by these contracts." They tried 2 more lawyers with the same result. By the 3rd day, Caleb was ready to give up. They'd spent money they didn't have, wasted time they couldn't afford, and gotten nowhere. They were sitting in a small restaurant near the courthouse, picking at food neither of them wanted, when an older man at the next table leaned over. "Couldn't help overhearing," he said. "You're the folks with the ranch debt problem?" Caleb nodded warily. "Name's Albert Finch, retired judge, served on the territorial bench for 20 years. He gestured to the empty chairs at their table. "Mind if I sit?" They didn't mind. Finch moved over, carrying a cup of coffee that looked like it had been refilled a dozen times. "Banking disputes are tricky," he said, "but there might be an angle you haven't considered. You said the bank waited 10 years to collect?" "That's right," Lena confirmed. "And during those 10 years you, the heir, made payments on other loans to the same bank?" "Several. We've been paying Henderson for years." Finch nodded slowly. "Then you might have a case for debt consolidation and restructuring. If the bank accepted payments from you without disclosing the full extent of your inherited debt, they might have waived their right to collect it all at once." "Might have?" Caleb asked. "It's not guaranteed, but it's an argument. You'd need to file a motion with the court, request a hearing. If the judge agrees that the bank acted in bad faith by hiding the debt until you had money, he might force them to restructure on terms you can actually meet." Lena leaned forward. "How long would that take?" "Filing the motion? A day. Getting a hearing? 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we push. We have less than 2 weeks before the bank forecloses." Finch smiled. "Filing the motion triggers an automatic stay on collection. They can't foreclose while the case is pending." For the first time in days, Caleb felt something like hope. "You'd be willing to help us?" "I'm retired, not much else to do. And I never liked banks that played games with people's lives." Finch extended his hand. "Let's see if we can't make Henderson's life difficult." They filed the motion the next day. Finch worked fast, drafting a petition that argued the bank had acted in bad faith by accepting payments without disclosure, by waiting until the debtor showed solvency before calling old debts, and by failing to provide adequate notice of the total obligation. It was a long shot wrapped in legal language, but it was something. The court clerk stamped the papers and promised a hearing within 2 weeks. Caleb and Lena rode back to Silver Hollow with cautious optimism. They weren't saved yet, not even close, but they'd bought time, and time was something. The crew met them in the yard and anxious for news. "We filed a legal challenge," Caleb told them. "The bank can't foreclose until the court hears the case." "And if we lose the case?" Marcus asked. "Then we lose the ranch, but at least we get a chance to fight." Jackson grinned. "Better than giving up." "Damn right," Charlie agreed. They went back to work with renewed energy, everyone moving a little faster, smiling a little more. It wasn't victory, but it was possibility, and that was enough. The hearing was scheduled for May 12th, 3 days before Henderson's original deadline. Caleb spent those 2 weeks preparing. Finch came to the ranch twice, reviewing documents, coaching him on what to say, how to present their case. The old judge was thorough, demanding, and occasionally brutal in his criticism. "You're too emotional," Finch said after one practice session. "The court doesn't care about your feelings. They care about facts and law. Stick to the facts." "The facts are that my father borrowed money to save his family and his ranch, and the bank is using that against me." "That's still emotion. Try again." Caleb tried again and again, until he could recite the timeline of payments and loans and interest without his voice shaking, without letting anger bleed into the words. Lena worked on the financial documentation, organizing every receipt, every payment record, every piece of correspondence with the bank going back 7 years. She built a case on paper, evidence of every time Caleb had paid Henderson without being told about the full debt, every time the bank had accepted money without disclosure. By the time the hearing arrived, they were as ready as they could be. The courtroom in Helena was smaller than Caleb expected. Wood paneling, rows of benches, a judge's bench that looked like it had been there since Montana was still a territory. Judge Warren presided, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. Henderson sat at the plaintiff's table with the bank's lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never lost a case in his life. Caleb and Lena sat with Finch, who, despite being retired, looked more comfortable in a courtroom than anywhere else. "All rise," the bailiff called. Judge Warren entered and took his seat. "Be seated. We're here in the matter of Ward versus First National Bank of Silver Hollow. Mr. Finch, you're representing the defendant? I am, Your Honor. Then let's proceed. Mr. Davidson, you may present the bank's case. The bank's lawyer stood and laid out their argument with clinical precision. The debt was valid. The contracts were signed. Mr. Ward's father had borrowed money with the ranch as collateral. Payment was due. The law was clear. He was efficient, articulate, and completely convincing. When he sat down, Finch rose. Your Honor, we don't dispute that the debt exists. We dispute the bank's right to collect it in this manner. For 10 years, First National accepted payments from Mr. Ward without disclosing the full extent of his inherited obligations. They allowed him to believe he was in good standing. They took his money while hiding the fact that he owed thousands more. That's not banking, that's entrapment. Objection, Davidson said. The bank had no obligation to remind Mr. Ward of debts clearly documented in public records. Public records my client never saw because he was 17 when his father died, and the bank never told him they existed, Finch shot back. We have 7 years of payment history showing good faith attempts to meet obligations. If the bank wanted the full debt paid, they should have said so. Instead, they waited until Mr. Ward showed solvency and then demanded everything at once. Judge Warren held up a hand. Mr. Finch, are you arguing the debt is invalid? No, Your Honor. We're arguing the collection method is, and we're requesting the court order a restructuring that allows Mr. Ward to pay what he owes over time, rather than forcing immediate foreclosure. The contracts specify payment terms, Davidson argued. Those terms have expired. The bank is within its rights. The bank waived those rights by accepting partial payments without disclosure. They went back and forth for an hour, legal arguments layered on top of each other until Caleb's head spun trying to follow them. Finally, Judge Warren called for a recess. Caleb, Lena, and Finch stepped outside the courtroom. Lena's hand found Caleb's, her grip tight. How are we doing? Caleb asked. Hard to say. Warren's fair, but he follows the law. The contracts are clear. Finch rubbed his jaw. We need to convince him that enforcing them as written would be unjust. Can we? We'll find out. They returned to the courtroom an hour later. Judge Warren looked tired, like he'd spent the recess reading through all the documents twice. I've reviewed the contracts and the payment history, he said, and I'm prepared to rule. The debt is valid. The bank has a legal right to collect. However, he paused. The bank's failure to disclose the full obligation while accepting partial payments creates an equity issue. Mr. Ward acted in good faith. The bank did not act in bad faith, but they certainly didn't act with full transparency. Caleb held his breath. Therefore, Warren continued, I'm ordering a restructuring. Mr. Ward will pay the outstanding debt over 5 years, with reasonable interest, in monthly installments. The bank will not foreclose provided those payments are made on time. Foreclosure is stayed pending compliance with the new terms. Caleb felt Lena's hand tighten in his. Your Honor, Davidson stood. The bank objects. Noted and overruled. My decision stands. Warren banged his gavel. This court is adjourned. For a second, nobody moved. Then Lena threw her arms around Caleb's neck, and Finch was shaking his hand, and somewhere behind them Henderson was arguing with his lawyer. But none of that mattered because they'd won. Not completely, not forever, but they'd won enough. Outside the courthouse, the Montana sun was bright and warm. Caleb stood on the steps with Lena beside him, feeling like he'd just fought the battle of his life and somehow survived. 5 years of payments, Lena said. That's manageable. If we're careful, if nothing goes wrong. When does anything not go wrong? She smiled up at him. We'll manage. We always do. Finch joined them, looking satisfied. That was closer than I'd like, but we got what we needed. The bank will be angry, but they'll comply. Warren doesn't tolerate contempt. What do we owe you? Caleb asked. Dinner and a good story about how you ended up in this mess in the first place. The old judge tipped his hat. Consider it payment for keeping me entertained in my retirement. They ate at the same restaurant where they'd met Finch, and Caleb told the whole story. Lena arriving, the gangsters, the cattle drive, all of it. The judge listened with interest, occasionally asking questions, and by the end he was laughing. You two have lived more in 6 months than most people do in a lifetime. Feels like it, Lena said. What's next? You going to settle down, run the ranch peacefully? Caleb and Lena looked at each other. Probably not, Caleb said. Good. Peaceful is overrated. Finch raised his glass. To trouble. May you always have just enough to keep things interesting. They drank to that, and then to several other things. And by the time they left the restaurant, the sun had set, and the streets were lit with electric lights that made Helena look like something out of a dream. They rode home the next day, taking their time, stopping to rest the horses and themselves. Somewhere along the way, Caleb realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the bank, not of the debt, not of the future. They'd fought and survived and won, and whatever came next, they'd face it together. When they finally reached Silver Hollow Ranch, the crew was waiting in the yard. Cruz stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. Well? We won, Caleb said. The crew erupted in cheers. Jackson whooped and threw his hat in the air. Marcus and Ray grabbed each other in a back-slapping hug. Charlie actually danced a little jig, which was something Caleb never needed to see again, but couldn't help smiling at. Cruz walked up and shook Caleb's hand firmly. Told you we'd make it. You told me we were probably doomed. I contain multitudes. The foreman turned to Lena. Welcome home, Miss Hart, again. Good to be home, Martin, again. That night, after the celebration had wound down and the crew had drifted off to sleep, Caleb and Lena sat on the porch. The mountains were dark shapes against a star-filled sky, and the night was so quiet Caleb could hear his own heartbeat. We should get married, he said. Lena looked at him. Was that a proposal? Might have been. I'm not good at this. No, you're terrible at it. But she was smiling. Ask me properly. Caleb stood and held out his hand. When she took it, he pulled her to her feet and looked her in the eyes. Lena Hart, you saved my ranch, saved my life, and gave me a reason to keep fighting when I was ready to quit. I love you more than I know how to say, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. Will you marry me? That's better. She stepped close, her hands on his chest. Yes, I'll marry you. They kissed there on the porch, the mountains as witness, the stars overhead, and everything they'd fought for spread around them. They were married on the 1st of June in the ranch yard under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. There was no fancy church, no elaborate ceremony, just Cruz standing up as best man, the crew gathered in their cleanest shirts, and a traveling minister who happened to be passing through Silver Hollow on his way to Billings. Lena wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself, white cotton with lace at the collar. Caleb wore the suit his father had been married in, pulled from a trunk in the attic and altered to fit. It smelled like mothballs and old memories, but it was good enough. The minister spoke about commitment and partnership, about building a life together through hard times and good. Caleb barely heard him. He was too focused on Lena's face, on the way the sunlight caught in her hair, on the fact that this woman, this incredible, stubborn, brilliant woman, had chosen him. Do you, Caleb Ward, take Lena Hart to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Lena Hart, take Caleb Ward to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Caleb kissed her while the crew cheered, and Cruz smiled his rare smile, and somewhere in the mountains a hawk cried out like it was celebrating too. They had a party that lasted until past midnight. Cruz had somehow procured 3 bottles of decent whiskey. Marcus and Ray played fiddle and guitar, not particularly well, but with enthusiasm. The men danced with Lena one by one, awkward and earnest, while Caleb watched and felt his chest tighten with something that might have been happiness or might have been the terrifying awareness that he now had something precious to lose. Jackson got drunk on 2 glasses of whiskey and tried to make a speech that dissolved into hiccups and laughter. Charlie told stories about Caleb's father that were probably only half true but made everyone laugh anyway. Pete and David sang a song so off-key that even the horses looked offended. Near midnight, Caleb found Lena sitting on the porch steps, watching the party from a distance. He sat beside her. You all right? More than all right, just taking it in. She leaned her head on his shoulder. A year ago, I was running from Chicago with everything I owned in a carpet bag. Now I'm married to a rancher in Montana, surrounded by people who feel like family. It's a lot. Good lot or bad lot? The best lot. She turned to look at him. I never thought I'd have this. A home. People who cared whether I lived or died. Someone who looked at me the way you're looking at me right now. How am I looking at you? Like I'm the only thing in the world that matters. Caleb kissed her forehead. That's because you are. They sat there while the party continued behind them, the music and laughter drifting across the yard. And Caleb thought about how far they'd come from that first morning when Lena had driven up in a wagon asking for work. Everything that had happened since, the fights, the fear, the impossible odds, it had all led here, to this moment, to this feeling of rightness that settled in his bones like he'd finally found the place he was supposed to be. The next morning, they got back to work. There was no honeymoon, no time off. The ranch didn't stop needing attention just because they'd gotten married. The cattle needed tending. The fences needed mending. The monthly payment to Henderson was due in 2 weeks, and there were a dozen other tasks that required immediate attention. But it felt different now. Caleb noticed it in small ways. The way Lena hummed while she cooked breakfast. The way the crew worked with a little more energy. The way the ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, like it knew the worst was over. They were still broke. Still in debt for years to come. Still one bad season away from trouble. But they were together. And that changed the mathematics somehow, made the impossible feel merely difficult. Lena threw herself into improving the ranch with the same intensity she'd brought to everything else. She reorganized the accounts, finding efficiencies Caleb had missed. She negotiated better prices with suppliers, leveraging the ranch's improving reputation. She even convinced 2 neighboring ranchers to go in on a shared breeding program, pooling resources to improve all their herds. Within 3 months, the monthly payments to Henderson were being made on time with money left over. Within 6 months, they'd hired 2 more men and expanded the herd by 50 head. The ranch wasn't just surviving anymore. It was growing. Caleb watched it happen with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. "How are you doing this?" Lena looked up from the ledger she'd been studying. "Doing what?" "Making this work. We were drowning 6 months ago. Now we're actually ahead." "We're not ahead. We're treading water successfully." But she was smiling. "The difference is we're not fighting alone anymore. You've got a full crew. I've got the books under control. And we're making smart decisions instead of desperate ones." "I was making desperate decisions before you got here?" "You were bleeding money and hoping things would magically improve." "That's not a strategy, Caleb. That's a prayer." He couldn't argue with that. The first winter as a married couple was hard, but not impossible. They lost 3 calves to cold and 2 more to wolves. A late storm damaged part of the new barn roof. Jackson broke his arm falling off a horse and was useless for 6 weeks. But they weathered it, literally and figuratively. Caleb learned that marriage to Lena meant arguments about things he'd never considered worth arguing about. How to organize the tool shed, whether to invest in new equipment or save for emergencies, what constituted appropriate winter provisions. She was stubborn and opinionated and refused to back down when she thought she was right, which was most of the time. And she was usually actually right, which made it worse. But they learned to fight fair, to listen even when they didn't want to find compromise in the space between his caution and her ambition. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's limits, the shapes of the silences that meant thinking versus the silences that meant trouble. By spring, they'd settled into something that felt like partnership in the truest sense. 2 people pulling the same direction, even when they disagreed about the route. The crew noticed. Cruz commented on it one evening when he and Caleb were checking the cattle in the south pasture. "You 2 are good together," the foreman said. "Most days. Every day. Even when you're arguing." Cruz shifted in his saddle. "Your father and mother had that too. That thing where they made each other better just by being in the same room. It's rare." "You ever find it?" "Once. Long time ago. Didn't work out." Cruz's expression was unreadable. "But I'm glad you did. The ranch needs it. We all do." Caleb thought about that as they rode back, the way one good partnership could lift everyone around it, create a foundation stable enough to build on. His father and mother had done that. Now he and Lena were doing it, and the ranch was thriving because of it. Not thriving in the sense of being rich or easy, but thriving in the sense of being alive, functional, moving forward instead of circling the drain. That summer, they expanded further, added another 50 head of cattle, hired a young wrangler named Sam who'd worked ranches in Wyoming, built a second bunkhouse to accommodate the growing crew. Lena even convinced Caleb to invest in better equipment, a new plow, proper tools, things that would save time and money in the long run. "We're spending money we should be saving," Caleb argued. "We're investing in efficiency. It's different." "Sounds the same to me." "That's because you think like a miser. I think like a businesswoman. I'm not a miser. I'm careful. You're terrified of debt to the point of paralysis. We've been making payments on time for a year. We can afford to invest in the ranch's future." She was right, of course. The new equipment paid for itself within 3 months. Caleb stopped arguing with her about money after that. The second winter was easier than the first. They'd learned from their mistakes, prepared better, stocked more supplies. They only lost 1 calf, and the barn roof held against the storms. And in February, Lena told Caleb she was pregnant. They were in the kitchen when she said it, late at night after the crew had gone to bed. Caleb was reviewing the books, trying to make sense of the numbers Lena had reorganized into a system that actually made sense, but still looked like witchcraft to him. "Caleb?" "I need to tell you something." Something in her voice made him look up. She was standing by the stove, hands folded in front of her, expression nervous in a way he'd never seen before. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think anything's wrong, but She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." The world tilted sideways. Caleb stood up so fast his chair fell over. We're having a baby." "Yes." She watched him carefully. "Are you happy about this?" He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled her into a hug that lifted her off the ground. "Happy?" "Lena, I'm terrified and thrilled and completely unprepared, but yeah, I'm happy." She laughed against his shoulder, her arms tight around his neck. "Good, because I'm all those things too." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, while outside the February wind howled and the ranch settled into sleep, and their future rearranged itself around this new reality. A baby. They were going to have a baby. Caleb had no idea how to be a father. His own father had been good at it, patient, kind, present, but had died before Caleb could learn all the important lessons. And now he was supposed to pass those lessons on to someone else? The weight of it was staggering, but when he looked at Lena's face, saw the mixture of fear and hope and determination there, he thought maybe they'd figure it out the same way they'd figured out everything else. Together, imperfectly, but trying their best. The crew took the news with enthusiasm that bordered on chaos. Jackson immediately started building a cradle, despite having no carpentry skills whatsoever. Marcus and Ray argued about whether it would be a boy or girl and what they should name it. Charlie offered to teach the child to ride as soon as it could walk, which Lena politely declined. Cruz just smiled and said, "Congratulations, the ranch could use some new life." Lena worked through her pregnancy with the same intensity she brought to everything else, refusing to slow down until Caleb and Cruz staged what amounted to an intervention in her 7th month. "You need to rest," Caleb said. "I'm resting right now. I'm sitting." Sitting while reviewing the accounts doesn't count as resting. Then what does count? Literally anything that doesn't involve working. She glared at him. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still do my job." "No one's saying you can't. We're saying you shouldn't do all of your job all the time without ever stopping." Cruz's voice was gentle but firm. "Let us help, Lena. That's what we're here for." She looked between them, clearly ready to argue further. Then her shoulders sagged. "I don't know how to not work. It's all I've ever done." "Then learn," Caleb said. "For the baby. For yourself, please." She agreed, reluctantly, to delegate more. Let Cruz handle the accounts. Let Jackson and Sam take over more of the kitchen duties. Let herself rest in ways she'd never allowed before. It was uncomfortable for her. Caleb could see that. She'd spent her whole life being useful, proving her worth through work, learning to accept help, to trust others to carry weight she'd always carried alone. It went against every instinct she had, but she tried. And slowly, carefully, she learned that letting people help didn't make her weak. It made the whole operation stronger. Their daughter was born in September on a morning when the mountains were sharp against a crystalline sky. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Caleb thought he might lose them both. But Lena was strong, stronger than he'd ever fully appreciated. And when the midwife finally handed him a squalling, red-faced infant, he felt something in his chest break open. They named her Sarah, after Caleb's mother. Sarah Ward came into the world angry and loud and absolutely perfect. The crew tiptoed around the house for the first week, terrified of disturbing the baby. But Sarah proved to be resilient, sleeping through Cruz's loud voice and Jackson's enthusiastic attempts to entertain her and the general chaos of ranch life. Lena took to motherhood with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything else. She nursed Sarah, changed her, rocked her through crying fits, all while somehow still managing to keep an eye on the ranch finances and make sure the crew was fed. Caleb tried to help, but he was terrible at it. He held Sarah too stiffly, panicked when she cried, couldn't figure out how to change a diaper without creating a disaster. "You're overthinking it," Lena told him one night when he'd spent 20 minutes trying to get Sarah to stop crying. "I don't know what she wants." "Neither do I, half the time. But you can't logic your way through this. You just have to be present. Hold her. Let her know you're there." He tried that, just held his daughter, stopped trying to fix whatever was wrong, just existed with her in the moment. Eventually, she stopped crying and fell asleep against his chest. "See?" Lena said softly. "You're better at this than you think." The ranch adjusted around the new arrival. The crew built a small nursery off the main bedroom. Marcus carved toys that Sarah was too young to appreciate, but that sat on shelves waiting for the day she could play with them. Even Charlie, rough and weathered, spoke in gentler tones when Sarah was in the room. They became a family in ways Caleb hadn't anticipated. Not just him and Lena and Sarah, but all of them, the crew, the ranch, the land itself. They were bound together by shared work and shared purpose, and the kind of loyalty that only came from fighting through hell together and coming out the other side. The years that followed weren't easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, and prices that fluctuated wildly. There were injuries and illnesses and near disasters that required all of them working together to overcome. But they endured. By Sarah's third birthday, the ranch was profitable enough that they'd paid off half the debt to Henderson. By her fifth, they'd hired a dozen men and were running close to 1,000 head of cattle. By her seventh, Silver Hollow Ranch was known across 3 territories as one of the best-run operations in Montana. People asked Caleb how he'd done it, how he'd taken a failing ranch and turned it into something successful. He always gave the same answer: "I didn't do it alone," because that was the truth. Every success, every victory, every moment of triumph, it belonged to all of them. To Lena, who'd rebuilt the foundation, to Cruz, who'd stayed when he could have left, to the crew who'd fought gangsters and driven cattle through impossible conditions, to everyone who'd believed the ranch was worth saving. Caleb had learned something important in those years, something his father had tried to teach him, but that he'd only understood through living it. Success wasn't about individual achievement. It was about finding the right people and building something together that none of you could have built alone. It was about trust, about loyalty, about showing up every day and doing the work, even when the work was hard and the outcome was uncertain. It was about refusing to give up, not because you were sure you'd win, but because giving up meant abandoning the people who'd stood beside you. One evening in late summer, when Sarah was 9 and already showing signs of her mother's fierce intelligence and her father's stubborn determination, Caleb sat on the porch with Lena watching the sun set behind the mountains. The ranch spread around them, buildings in good repair, fences strong, cattle dotting the pastures. In the bunkhouse, the crew was settling in for the night. In the barn, the horses were fed and comfortable. Everything was in its place, functioning, alive. "You ever think about how close we came to losing all this?" Caleb asked. "Every day," Lena said. "That's why I don't take it for granted." "Do you regret it? Coming here? Everything that happened?" She looked at him like he'd asked the stupidest question in the world. "Regret meeting you? Building a life here? Having Sarah?" "No, Caleb, I don't regret any of it. Even the parts where you almost died. Even those. They made me who I am, made us who we are." She took his hand. "You can't have the good without the hard. That's not how life works." He knew she was right. The ranch had almost killed them a dozen times over, but it had also given them everything that mattered: purpose, community, each other. Sarah came running out of the house, her hair wild from playing, her face dirty in the way that meant she'd been somewhere she probably shouldn't have been. "Papa, Mama, Jackson says there's going to be a meteor shower tonight. Can we stay up and watch?" Caleb looked at Lena, who shrugged. "It's summer, no school tomorrow." "All right," Caleb said. "But you have to help with morning chores if you stay up late." "Deal!" Sarah threw her arms around both of them, then ran back inside shouting for Jackson. Caleb watched her go, this small person who carried pieces of both of them, who'd never known the ranch as anything but stable and thriving, who had no idea how close it had all come to falling apart. Maybe that was okay. Maybe the next generation didn't need to carry the weight of the previous one's struggles. Maybe they just needed to benefit from the foundation those struggles had built. "What are you thinking about?" Lena asked. "Legacy. What we're leaving behind." "We're leaving behind a working ranch and a daughter who's going to be formidable when she grows up. That's not nothing." "It's everything," Caleb agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky deepened to purple and the first stars began to appear. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight. Around them, the ranch settled into evening quiet. And in that moment, Caleb felt something he'd been chasing for years without knowing it. Peace. Not the absence of conflict or challenge, not the smooth, easy life that some people seem to have, but the deep, bone-level peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do, with exactly the people you were meant to be with. He'd learned something else too, something he wished he could tell his younger self, the man who'd stood in this same spot years ago, watching his ranch die and feeling powerless to stop it. Survival wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about choosing who you stood beside when hardship came. Because it would come. It always did. The storms and droughts and financial crises and unexpected disasters, they were part of life, especially life on a ranch in Montana. But if you had the right people beside you, if you'd built something worth fighting for, then those hardships became obstacles to overcome instead of reasons to quit. Caleb had been ready to quit when Lena arrived, ready to let the bank take the ranch, ready to walk away from everything his father had built. But she'd shown him another way. Not through grand gestures or perfect solutions, but through consistent effort and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Through working the problems one at a time, finding solutions in places he hadn't thought to look, and dragging him forward when he wanted to give up. She'd saved the ranch. But more than that, she'd saved him. And in return, he'd given her what she'd been running toward when she fled Chicago. A home. A place where she belonged. People who valued her for who she was, not what she could do for them. They'd saved each other, really. Built something together that neither of them could have built alone. That was the real lesson in all of this, Caleb thought. The thing worth remembering and passing on to Sarah when she was old enough to understand. Life wasn't about individual heroics. It was about partnership. About finding the people who made you better and holding on to them when everything else fell apart. It was about showing up. About doing the work. About refusing to quit on each other even when quitting would have been easier. "They're starting," Lena said, pointing at the sky. Streaks of light began to fall across the darkness, meteors burning through the atmosphere, brief and brilliant. Sarah came running out with Jackson behind her, both of them craning their necks to watch the sky. Crews emerged from the bunkhouse, followed by Marcus and Ray and the others, all of them drawn by the spectacle. They gathered in the yard, this assembled family of blood and choice, watching the heavens put on a show. Caleb pulled Lena close, his arm around her waist, Sarah leaning against his other side. Around them, the crew pointed and exclaimed as particularly bright meteors streaked past. "Make a wish, Papa," Sarah said. "What should I wish for?" "I don't know. Whatever you want most." Caleb thought about it. There were practical things he could wish for. Good weather, healthy cattle, stable prices. There were ambitious things, expanding the ranch further, paying off the debt entirely, building an empire. But looking around at the people gathered here, at the ranch that had become home, at the life they'd built from ashes and determination, Caleb realized he didn't need to wish for anything. He already had everything that mattered. "I wish," he said slowly, "for more nights like this. All of us together, watching something beautiful, grateful for what we have." "That's a good wish," Lena said softly. Sarah wrinkled her nose. "That's boring. I'm wishing for a pony." Everyone laughed, and the moment broke into easy conversation and good-natured teasing. But Caleb's wish hung in the air, simple and true. More nights like this, more chances to gather with people who mattered, more moments of peace in between the struggles, more life, lived fully, with intention and gratitude. The meteor shower continued for another hour before the crew drifted back to the bunkhouse and Sarah finally allowed herself to be carried to bed. Caleb and Lena remained on the porch, the night cool around them, the sky still occasionally streaked with falling stars. "You know what I realized," Lena said. "When I drove up that first morning, asking for work, I thought I was running away from something, from Cord, from Chicago, from my past. But I wasn't running away. I was running toward this. I just didn't know it yet." Think you would have come if you'd known what you were getting into? The gangsters and the near-death experiences and the cattle drives? Probably not, she smiled. But the rest of it? You, Sarah, the ranch, this life? Absolutely. Without question. Caleb kissed the top of her head. I'm glad you came, even if you didn't know you were supposed to. Me too. They stood there until the meteors faded and the night grew too cold to ignore, then went inside to the house they'd built together, to the life they'd fought for, to the future they were creating one day at a time. The ranch would face more challenges. Caleb knew that. There would be bad years and good years, wins and losses, moments of triumph and moments of despair. But they'd face them together, him and Lena and Sarah and the crew, and anyone else who joined their assembled family over the years to come. Because that was what they'd learned, what they'd proven over and over again. You didn't survive by being perfect. You didn't succeed by avoiding failure. You endured by standing together, by refusing to abandon each other when things got hard, by finding strength in partnership that you couldn't find alone. Silver Hollow Ranch would last because they'd built it on that foundation. Not on money or luck or perfect planning, but on loyalty and trust and the stubborn determination to keep showing up for each other, no matter what. That was a legacy worth leaving, a story worth telling. And as Caleb climbed the stairs to the bedroom he shared with Lena, checking in on Sarah sleeping peacefully in her room along the way, he felt the weight of the past finally lift. They'd made it. Not easily, not smoothly, not without scars and struggles and moments when everything seemed lost. But they'd made it, and that was enough. In the years that followed, the story of Silver Hollow Ranch became legend in Montana. People told it in saloons and around campfires, embellishing the details, arguing about what parts were true. But the core of it remained constant. A failing ranch, a mysterious cook, a fight against impossible odds, a cattle drive through hell, a love story born in the midst of chaos, a family built from determination and choice. Some said it couldn't have happened the way people claimed. Life didn't work like that, they argued. People didn't just show up at the right moment and save everything. But the people who'd lived it knew better. They knew that life did work like that sometimes, when you were desperate enough and brave enough and stubborn enough to let it. They knew that the right person showing up at the right moment wasn't fate or luck. It was just the universe giving you a chance. What you did with that chance, whether you seized it or let it pass, that was up to you. Caleb and Lena had seized it, had fought for it, had built something lasting from it, and in doing so, they'd proven something important, that survival wasn't about being strong enough to face hardship alone. It was about being wise enough to know when you needed help, and brave enough to accept it when it came. It was about choosing your people and standing by them. It was about building something bigger than yourself. It was about showing up, day after day, even when showing up was hard. That was the real story of Silver Hollow Ranch. Not a fairy tale where everything worked out perfectly, but a harder, truer story about imperfect people doing their best and somehow managing to build something worth keeping. And that story, messy and difficult and absolutely real, was worth more than any perfect ending could ever be. Because perfect endings don't teach you anything. But surviving the imperfect middle, fighting through the impossible, and coming out the other side changed, that teaches you everything.